You really think a place like this would hire someone like you? The bartender sneered, sliding the rag across the counter without even looking up. Emily Carter didn't answer. She just stood there in the doorway of the most feared bar in the entire county, her last $23 folded in her pocket, and told herself she had nowhere left to run. If you're watching this story right now, comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe some families are chosen not born, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end. The desert sun was already merciless at 9 in the morning, and Emily Carter had been standing outside that door for almost 20 minutes before she found the courage to push it open. The building didn't look like much from the outside, cracked stucco walls the color of old bone, a parking lot full of motorcycles gleaming like a row of sleeping animals, and a sign hanging crooked above the entrance that read "Vultures Roost" in letters so faded you had to squint to read them at all. Underneath, someone had taped a handwritten piece of paper to the door. Bartender wanted, no experience necessary, ask for Raymond. Everybody in that small Arizona town knew exactly what the Vultures Roost was, and everybody knew exactly who Raymond was. It was a Hell's Angels bar. Emily had heard the stories her whole life, the way every kid in that town had heard them passed around like ghost stories at sleepovers. Stay away from that place. Those men are dangerous. Nobody who works there lasts more than a couple weeks. One story said a waitress quit after 3 days because she couldn't stand the way they looked at her. Another story said a man who tried to rob the place never walked right again. Emily didn't know which stories were true and which ones were just small town noise, the kind of thing people said about anyone who looked different, rode different, lived different. All she knew was that she had already called every diner, every gas station, every retail store in a 40-mile radius, and nobody was hiring. Nobody wanted a 23-year-old with no college degree, no local references, and a resume with a 6-month gap she didn't want to explain to strangers. She had exactly $412 to her name after she paid this month's rent, and rent was already 3 days late. So when she saw that piece of paper taped to a door that everyone in town swore you should never walk through, she didn't see danger. She saw a paycheck. Her hand was shaking when she finally pushed the door open, and the first thing that hit her wasn't fear. It was the smell leather cigarette smoke that had soaked into the walls for probably 20 years, and stale beer that no amount of cleaning could ever fully remove. The place was dim, even with the morning sun blazing outside, lit mostly by neon signs advertising beer brands that didn't exist anymore. A pool table sat in the corner with a rip down the center of the felt. The jukebox in the back looked older than she was, and there were men everywhere, not the crowd she expected. It wasn't even noon, but there were maybe a dozen men scattered around the bar, some playing cards, some just nursing coffee, all of them wearing the same leather vest with patches she didn't recognize, patches that told stories she couldn't read. Every single one of them stopped what they were doing when the door swung open and sunlight spilled across the floor. Every single one of them looked at her. Emily froze. For a moment, nobody said a word. She could hear the hum of an old refrigerator behind the bar, the click of pool balls that had stopped mid-motion, the faint scratch of a radio playing classic rock too low to make out the words. She almost turned around right there. She almost let the door swing shut behind her and walked straight back to her car and drove away and figured out some other way to survive because every instinct in her body was screaming that she had made a terrible mistake. But then a voice cut through the silence, low and rough, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "You lost, sweetheart." Emily turned toward the voice and found herself looking at a man built like a mountain that had learned how to walk. He had to be pushing 60 with a gray beard trimmed close to his jaw and hair pulled back into a short ponytail streaked with silver. His arms were covered in tattoos so faded with age that some of them had turned the color of an old bruised blue-green ink softened by decades under desert sun. He wore a black leather vest with patches sewn across the front and back, and stitched in bold red letters across a white patch on his chest was a single word: Hell's Angels. This had to be Raymond. Emily's mouth went dry. She thought about every story she'd ever heard about this place, every warning, every whispered rumor about men like this one. She thought about walking out. She thought about how humiliating it would be to turn around now, in front of all these eyes, and go back to a life with no answers. She thought about her empty refrigerator. She thought about the eviction notice sitting on her kitchen counter. She lifted her chin instead. "I'm here about the job. she said, and she was proud that her voice didn't shake, even though her hands were doing exactly that behind her back. The bartender job. A few of the men near the pool table exchanged glances. One of them let out a short laugh, quickly cut off by a look from somebody else. The man behind the bar, the one who had spoken first, folded his thick arms across his chest and studied her the way you'd study a used car you weren't sure you wanted to buy. You ever tend bar before? No, Emily admitted. There was no point lying. But I learn fast and I show up on time, and I'm not afraid of hard work. You're not afraid of hard work, he repeated like he was tasting the words to see if they were true. But are you afraid of us? The question hung in the air like smoke. Emily looked around the room again, slower this time. She noticed things she hadn't noticed in her first panicked glance. An older man near the window had a cane hooked over the back of his chair and a purple heart tattoo on his forearm. Two men near the pool table were arguing good-naturedly about a shot, laughing in a way that felt more like brothers than criminals. A younger man in the corners was reading a paperback novel, completely uninterested in the newcomer at the door. They didn't look like the monsters the town had described. They looked like men. Tired men. Older men. Men who had lived hard lives and worn every year of it on their skin. I'm not going to pretend I'm not nervous, Emily said finally. Everybody in this town has a story about this place, but I need this job. I need it more than I'm scared of whatever people say about you. So no, I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm not afraid. I'm going to tell you I'm desperate enough not to let that stop me. Silence again. Then the big man behind the bar, Raymond, did something Emily didn't expect. He smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It barely moved the corners of his mouth, but it reached his eyes in a way that made the tension in the room ease just slightly, like a held breath, finally released. Name's Raymond, he said, extending a hand roughened by decades of work that had nothing to do with sitting behind a desk. I run this place and I run the local chapter. Emily shook his hand. His grip was firm but careful, like a man who had learned somewhere along the way that strength didn't need to hurt to be felt. Emily, she said, Emily Carter. Well, Emily Carter, Raymond said, leaning back against the bar. Why would a young woman like you walk into a place everybody in this town warns people to stay away from? And there it was, the question that would define everything that came after it. Emily could have lied. She could have made up some story about needing extra cash or wanting a change of scenery. It would have been easier. It would have been safer in a way to keep the truth locked up where nobody could use it against her. But something about the way Raymond looked at her patient, unhurried, like he already knew there was more to the story and wasn't going anywhere until he heard it, made the truth spill out before she could stop it. Because everyone else already turned their backs on me, she said quietly. I lost my job 4 months ago. My landlord's threatening eviction. My fiancé left 2 weeks after I lost the job, told me I was, and I quote, too much of a liability right now. My own mother told me I should have just stayed with him and figured it out because at least then I'd have somewhere to live. Her voice cracked slightly and she hated herself for it, but she pushed through anyway. I've applied to every single place in this town that's hiring and nobody wants me. So I saw that sign on your door and I figured, what do I have left to lose? Everyone already thinks I'm nothing. Might as well see if the scariest place in town will give me a chance. Nobody else will. The bar had gone quiet in a different way now. Not tense, something closer to respect. Raymond studied her for a long moment, and Emily had the distinct feeling that she was being measured against some invisible standard weighed by a man who had probably seen every kind of liar walk through that door trying to talk their way into something they didn't deserve. You know what people say about us, Raymond said. It wasn't a question. I've heard the stories, Emily admitted, and you walked in anyway. I didn't have anywhere else to walk to. Raymond nodded slowly, like that answer satisfied something in him that a rehearsed speech never could have. He turned to look at the room, at the dozen or so men who had been watching this entire exchange without saying a word. Anybody got a problem with giving this girl a shot? Nobody spoke. A few of the older men shrugged. The man with the purple heart tattoo gave a short nod. The two men who had been arguing about pool shots exchanged a glance, and one of them shrugged like it made no difference to him either way. Shift starts at 11, Raymond said, turning back to Emily. You clean glasses, you stock the bar, you learn the register, and if you're still standing at the end of the week, we'll talk about actually letting you pour drinks. Pay is 11 an hour plus tips, and I'll tell you right now, the men who drink here tip better than you'd think, as long as you don't disrespect them. I won't, Emily said immediately. And Emily, Raymond's voice dropped just slightly, just enough to make her pay attention. Whatever you heard about us out there in that town, you're going to find out real quick that most of it's wrong. But some of it might be true too. We're not saints. We've got history, some of us darker than others. But there's one rule in this club that never bends, and if you're going to work here, you need to understand it now before you take one more step inside. Emily swallowed hard. What rule? We protect our own, Raymond said simply. You work here long enough, you prove yourself, you become one of ours. And nobody messes with what belongs to this club. Not while I'm standing. Emily didn't fully understand what those words meant yet. She thought it was just a boss laying out expectations, the kind of thing any manager might say on a first day. She had no idea, standing there in that dim bar with sunlight slicing through cracks in the blinds, that those words would become the single most important sentence anyone had ever said to her. She had no idea how much she would need them. Thank you, she said instead, because it was the only thing she could think to say. You won't regret this. We'll see, Raymond said, but there was no cruelty in it, just the tired honesty of a man who had said yes to plenty of people who let him down before. He turned and shouted toward the back of the bar. Jackson, get out here and show the new hire where the mop is. A door near the back swung open and a man stepped out, who made Emily's stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sheer physical presence he carried into the room. He looked to be somewhere in his late 30s, with dark hair, cut short, a jaw shadowed with stubble, and forearms wrapped in ink that told a story of their own. A story Emily couldn't read yet, but one she suspected wasn't a happy one. He wore the same vest as the others, HELLS Angels stitched boldly across the back, and a patch on the front that read Enforcer. He didn't smile. He barely glanced at her before his eyes moved to Raymond. You hired her, he asked, like Emily wasn't even standing 3 feet away. I did, Raymond said evenly. Jackson's jaw tightened. We talked about this. We don't know her. We don't know who she's connected to, who she talks to, what she'll do the first time things get complicated around here. She needed a chance, Raymond said. You remember what that felt like once, don't you? Something flickered across Jackson's face, something quick, something buried, something Emily wasn't meant to see but caught anyway. It was gone as fast as it appeared, replaced by the same hard, unreadable expression. Fine, Jackson said, but if she causes problems... She won't, Raymond said in a tone that made it clear the conversation was over. Jackson finally looked at Emily directly, and for a moment his dark eyes studied her, the way a man studies a lock he doesn't yet have the key to. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind either. It was simply assessing, cataloging, filing her away as an unknown variable in a world he clearly worked very hard to keep controlled. Mop's in the back, he said. Follow me. Emily glanced once more at Raymond, who gave her a small nod as if to say, go on, you'll be fine. And then she followed Jackson toward the back of the bar, past the pool table, past the row of men who watched her walk by without a word into a hallway that smelled like bleach in old wood. Don't touch anything behind the bar without asking first, Jackson said without turning around. Don't go into Raymond's office. Don't ask questions about the patches you don't understand. And don't... He stopped walking so suddenly that Emily nearly collided with his back, then turned to face her fully. Don't think for 1 second that just because Raymond gave you a job, you're one of us. Trust isn't handed out here. It's earned, and it takes a lot longer than one sad story to earn it. Emily met his gaze without flinching, even though every nerve in her body wanted to look away. I'm not asking to be trusted, she said. I'm asking for a paycheck, that's all. Something in Jackson's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite respect, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. We'll see, he said, echoing Raymond's words exactly, and turned to keep walking. Emily followed him deeper into the bar, into a storage room stacked with liquor boxes and cleaning supplies. And as Jackson explained her duties in short clipped sentences, she felt something strange settle over her. Something she hadn't expected to feel walking into the most feared building in town. She felt for the first time in months like she had somewhere to be. The first week at the Vulture's Roost tested Emily in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the physical work, she'd expected that, and honestly welcomed it, because scrubbing floors and hauling kegs gave her something to focus on besides the wreckage of her old life. What she hadn't expected was the constant quiet testing from every direction. The regulars watched her like hawks, waiting to see if she'd flinch at rough language, if she'd complain about the long hours, if she'd quit the moment something got difficult. She didn't. On her third day, a man named Tiny, who was anything but standing at least 6.5 feet tall with a beard that reached the middle of his chest, spilled an entire pitcher of beer across the bar just to see how she'd react. Emily didn't yell. She didn't complain. She grabbed a rag, cleaned it up without a word, and then poured him a fresh pitcher on the house, telling him with a small smile that accidents happen to everybody. Tiny had stared at her for a long moment, then let out a booming laugh that shook the walls. "She's all right," he announced to the room as if that settled some argument nobody else had heard. On her 5th day, an older biker, everyone called Doc, a man in his 70s, with hands that trembled slightly, when he lifted his coffee cup, came in looking paler than usual. Emily noticed before anyone else did. She noticed the way his breathing seemed shallow, the way he kept touching his chest when he thought nobody was watching. She didn't make a scene. She simply brought him a glass of water instead of his usual whiskey, sat down across from him for a moment, and asked quietly if he was feeling all right. "Just tired, sweetheart," Doc had said, waving her off. But Emily noticed the way Raymond's eyes flicked toward Doc from across the room, the way he made a discreet phone calls 20 minutes later, the way Doc ended up leaving early, with one of the younger members insisting on driving him home. Emily never mentioned it again, never made him feel embarrassed about it. But from that day forward, Doc always made sure to sit at her section of the bar, and he always tipped a little more than anyone else. By the end of her first week, Emily had memorized nearly every regular's usual order. She'd reorganized the chaotic mess behind the bar that nobody had touched in years, fixing a system so disorganized that finding a specific bottle used to take 5 minutes and now took 5 seconds. She'd fixed a leaky faucet in the bathroom that had been dripping for months because nobody bothered calling a plumber. She hadn't complained once, not even when a drunk customer from outside the club made a crude comment about her, and she had to grit her teeth and keep pouring drinks because Raymond had specifically told her he'd handle any real trouble himself. And Raymond did handle it. The very same night, in fact, the man had come back for a second round of comments, louder this time, cruder, the kind of thing that made Emily's hands shake as she gripped the bar rag so tight her knuckles turned white. Before she could even think of a response, Raymond was there standing beside her, with his arms crossed, his voice low and dangerous in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "You want to say that again?" The man had gone pale, mumbled an apology, and left without finishing his drink. Raymond hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened violence. He'd simply stood there, an immovable wall between Emily and anyone who might try to hurt her, and that was enough. "You didn't have to do that," Emily told him afterward, her voice still a little shaky. "Yeah, I did," Raymond said simply. "Told you. We protect our own." Emily wanted to argue that she wasn't their own. Not yet. Not really, she'd only worked there a week, but something about the certainty in his voice made her stop. Made her wonder if maybe somewhere along the way, without either of them fully realizing it, that had already started to change. It was Jackson who Emily found the hardest to read. He barely spoke to her beyond what was necessary for the job. He watched her from across the room, sometimes arms crossed, expression unreadable, like he was still waiting for the moment she'd prove Raymond wrong. But Emily noticed things about him too, the way she noticed things about everyone's small details most people missed. She noticed that Jackson was always the last to leave at night, walking the parking lot to make sure every bike was secure, checking the locks on the doors twice. She noticed that despite his cold exterior, he never once raised his voice at any of the younger members, even when they made mistakes that clearly frustrated him. She noticed that he always ordered the same thing, black coffee, no sugar, and that he barely touched alcohol at all, which seemed strange for a man who spent every night in a bar. She noticed a tattoo on his left forearm, partially hidden under his sleeve, that looked like a name, though she never asked whose. 2 weeks into the job, during a slow Tuesday afternoon, Emily was restocking the cooler when she heard Jackson's voice behind her, quieter than she'd ever heard it. "You're not what I expected," he said. Emily turned surprised. Is that a compliment or a complaint? The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Haven't decided yet." "Well, let me know when you do," Emily said and went back to stacking bottles. She thought that was the end of the conversation, but Jackson lingered. "Most people who walk through that door looking for a job," he said slowly. They're running from something, a bad relationship, debt, legal trouble. They think working here means easy money, no question asked, because everybody assumes we're all criminals anyway. So what's one more secret in a room full of them? And what did you think I was running from? Emily asked. I thought you were running from something you'd regret telling us, Jackson admitted. Everybody usually is. I'm not running from anything illegal, if that's what you're asking, Emily said. I'm running from people who made me believe I wasn't worth investing in. That's all. No warrants, no debts I'm hiding, no secret criminal past, just a very boring, very sad story about believing the wrong people. Jackson studied her for a long moment. His dark eyes carried a weight Emily didn't understand yet. That's not boring, he said finally. That's the kind of story that breaks people. It almost broke me, Emily admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. I spent months barely getting out of bed after everything happened. I stopped answering calls from friends because I didn't want to explain what happened over and over, watching their pity turn into distance. I started believing maybe they were right about me. Who's they? Emily hesitated. She hadn't planned on saying his name out loud in this place, in this life she was building, brick by brick, separate from everything that came before. Doesn't matter, she said instead. Not anymore. Jackson didn't push. He simply nodded like he understood exactly what it meant to leave certain doors closed and turn to walk away. But before he did, he said one more thing quiet enough that Emily almost missed it. For what it's worth, he said, the men who break people like that, they're the real cowards. Took me a long time to understand that walking away from someone who breaks you isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing you can do. He left before Emily could respond, before she could ask what experience had taught him that lesson, before she could wonder how a man who wore a patch that said, "Enforcer, a man," everyone in town feared could speak with such quiet understanding about heartbreak. She didn't know it yet, but that conversation would matter more than she realized. By the end of the first month, Emily had become something of a fixture at the Vulture's Roost. The regulars greeted her by name when they walked in. Tiny had taken to calling her the Fixer because of how quickly she solved problems nobody else bothered to notice. Doc had started bringing her homemade cookies, his late wife's recipe, insisting she needed to eat more because she was too skinny for someone working double shifts. Even Raymond, a man Emily quickly learned rarely gave praise easily, had started trusting her with more responsibility. He taught her how to properly manage the register, how to handle the more complicated liquor orders, how to spot trouble before it started, so she could quietly alert one of the bigger members before things escalated. You've got good instincts, Raymond told her one evening, watching as she smoothly de-escalated a disagreement between two customers who'd had one too many. Better than some people who've worked here for years. I've had practice reading rooms, Emily said. You learn fast when you spend your whole life trying to avoid setting people off. Raymond's expression darkened slightly at that, though he didn't ask her to elaborate. Emily suspected he understood more than he let on. Understood the particular kind of survival instinct that comes from years of walking on eggshells around someone who controlled every aspect of your life. She still hadn't told anyone the full story. Not Raymond, not Jackson, not any of the men who'd slowly started treating her less like an outsider and more like someone who belonged. She hadn't told anyone about Daniel Cross. She hadn't told anyone about the 5 years she'd spent believing his voice was the only truth that mattered, that she was lucky he wanted her at all, that she'd amount to nothing without his money, his connections, his approval. She hadn't told anyone how methodically he'd cut her off from friends, from family, from anyone who might have told her the truth about what he was doing to her. She hadn't told anyone about the night she'd finally found the courage to leave, packing a single suitcase while he was out of town, terrified he'd come home early and find her trying to escape. She definitely hadn't told anyone that Daniel Cross was still out there somewhere, still successful, still wealthy, still convinced that Emily belonged to him, whether she agreed or not. She thought she'd left that life behind completely. She was wrong. It happened on a Thursday night, 6 weeks after Emily had first walked through the doors of the Vulture's Roost. The bar was busier than usual, filled with the low hum of conversation and the crack of pool balls, and classic rock playing from the jukebox that Emily had personally convinced Raymond to finally get fixed. She was behind the bar pouring a round of drinks for a table of regulars, laughing at something Tiny had said, feeling more relaxed and more herself than she had in over a year. Then the door opened, and every hair on Emily's body stood on end before she even turned around, because she recognized the sound of those particular footsteps, the confident, unhurried click of expensive dress shoes on old wooden floors, a sound that had once made her stomach drop with anticipation and now made it drop with something closer to dread. She turned around slowly, and there he was. Daniel Cross, standing in the doorway of the Vulture's Roost in a tailored gray suit that probably cost more than Emily made in 3 months, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile calm and confident and utterly out of place in a room full of leather vests and motorcycle patches. He looked directly at Emily, and that smile widened. "There you are," he said loud enough for the entire bar to hear. "I've been looking everywhere for you, sweetheart." The music seemed to fade. The conversations died down one by one as every head in the bar turned toward the door. Emily felt her hands go cold, felt the glass she was holding nearly slip from her fingers, felt 6 weeks of carefully rebuilt confidence threatening to crumble in an instant, because Daniel Cross had found her, and she had absolutely no idea how. Raymond's eyes moved from Daniel to Emily, taking in her frozen expression, her white knuckles gripping the edge of the bar. Jackson was already rising from his seat near the pool table, his body angling toward the door in a way that looked almost casual but wasn't casual at all. "You know this guy?" Raymond asked quietly, not taking his eyes off Daniel. Emily's voice came out barely above a whisper. "That's Daniel," she said. "That's the man I told you about, the one I ran from." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Daniel, oblivious to the shift, or simply too arrogant to notice it, took a step further into the bar, his eyes still locked on Emily with an expression of possessive amusement, like a man who'd finally located a lost item and was mildly annoyed at the inconvenience of having had to search for it at all. "You really think," he said, gesturing lazily around the room at the leather vests and tattooed arms and hard, watchful eyes now fixed entirely on him, "that hiding out in a biker bar was going to keep you from me forever, Emily, sweetheart? This is embarrassing. Come on, let's go home." The word home hit Emily like a slap. Because home for 5 years had meant a beautiful house that felt more like a cage. Home had meant walking on eggshells, apologizing for things that weren't her fault, watching every word before it left her mouth. Home had meant Daniel Cross deciding what she wore, who she spoke to, what she was allowed to want for herself. She was never going back to that. Emily set down the glass in her hand very carefully, very deliberately, and looked directly into the eyes of the man who had once convinced her she was worthless without him. "This isn't your home anymore, Daniel," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, didn't shake at all. "It never really was." Daniel's smile flickered just slightly, the first crack in his carefully constructed confidence. "Emily," he said, his tone shifting, growing colder, more familiar in a way that made Emily's stomach twist. "Don't do this in front of these people. Let's talk outside, like adults." "I think she's exactly where she wants to be," Raymond said, stepping forward, his voice a low rumble that carried more weight than any shout could have. "And I think you should leave." Daniel's eyes flicked toward Raymond, sizing him up, and for just a moment, something like uncertainty crossed his expensive, polished features. But arrogance apparently ran deep in men like Daniel Cross, because that uncertainty didn't last. "And you are?" Daniel asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Someone who's about to ask you to leave a second time," Raymond said. "I don't usually ask twice." Jackson had moved to stand directly beside Emily, now close enough that Daniel couldn't miss the message being sent, not standing in front of her like a shield, but beside her like a wall that had chosen its position deliberately, an equal rather than a rescuer. Emily felt something steady settle in her chest at the sight of him there. Something that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the simple, overwhelming relief of not being alone. Daniel's gaze swept the room again, taking in the number of leather-clad men now standing, now watching, now positioned strategically around the bar in a way that made his expensive suit and polished shoes look suddenly very small and very out of place. "This isn't over," Daniel said, his voice tight, the mask of calm confidence cracking further. "Emily, you have obligations, financial obligations, legal obligations. You think you can just disappear and none of that matters." Emily's heart pounded because there it was, the threat, the leverage, the thing Daniel always used when charm and manipulation failed. Money, contracts, the complicated financial arrangements he'd tied her into during their relationship arrangements. She still didn't fully understand arrangements he'd always used to remind her she couldn't simply walk away without consequences. For a moment, the old fear rose up in her chest, familiar and suffocating. But then she looked around the room, at Raymond immovable as a mountain, at Jackson steady beside her, at Tiny and Doc and every other face in that bar who had spent the last 6 weeks watching her prove herself, watching her earn a place she never expected to find. She wasn't the same woman who had left Daniel's house with a single suitcase, terrified and alone. "Send me the paperwork," Emily said, her voice steady now, stronger than she'd felt in years. "I'll have someone look at it, but you don't get to threaten me anymore, Daniel. That part of my life is over." Daniel's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but Raymond took another step forward, close enough now that Daniel had to look up slightly to maintain eye contact, and whatever Daniel had planned to say seemed to die somewhere in his throat. "She said what she needed to say," Raymond said quietly. "I suggest you listen and go." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The jukebox continued playing in the background, oddly cheerful against the weight of the silence in the room. Daniel's eyes moved once more across the bar, across the faces watching him, before finally settling back on Emily, with an expression that mixed fury with something that looked almost like disbelief, as if he genuinely could not comprehend a version of reality where Emily Carter didn't need him, didn't want him, wasn't afraid of him anymore. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, the threat unmistakable despite the calm delivery. "I doubt it," Emily said. Daniel turned and walked out the door, swinging shut behind him with a bang that seemed to echo through the sudden quiet of the bar. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Tiny let out a low whistle. "Well," he said, "that was something." Emily realized her hands were shaking, the adrenaline finally catching up to her now that the confrontation was over. Raymond turned to look at her, his expression softer than she'd seen it before. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know," Emily admitted honestly. "That's the first time I've stood up to him. Ever in 5 years." "Took guts," Jackson said quietly beside her. "I had help," Emily said, looking between the two of them. "I don't think I could have done that alone." "You didn't have to find out," Raymond said. "That's kind of the point." Emily felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from something closer to overwhelming relief mixed with a fear she couldn't quite shake. Because she knew Daniel Cross. She knew the particular dangerous stubbornness of a man who had never once in his life accepted the word no as a final answer. This wasn't over. Whatever paperwork he'd threatened her with, whatever financial obligations he claimed still existed, whatever legal complications he might try to manufacture, Emily suspected this confrontation was only the very beginning of a much larger battle. And somewhere out there in his expensive car, driving back toward whatever gleaming office building he'd flown in from Daniel Cross, was already planning his next move. Because men like Daniel didn't lose gracefully. And men like Daniel didn't lose at all, not without making everyone around them pay for daring to believe otherwise. Raymond watched the door for a long moment after it swung shut, his expression unreadable. His jaw tight with something that looked like calculation rather than simple anger. "Jackson," he said finally, not taking his eyes off the door. "Yeah, find out everything you can about this Daniel Cross, tonight." Jackson nodded once, already pulling out his phone. Emily watched the exchange with a growing knot of anxiety in her stomach, understanding suddenly that she had brought her old life crashing directly into the middle of the new one she'd been so carefully building. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, to somehow take responsibility for the storm she feared she just brought to their doorstep. But Raymond turned to her before she could say a word, his expression firm and unwavering. "Don't," he said, as if he could read the apology forming on her lips. "You didn't do anything wrong. He did. And now we're going to make sure he understands exactly what happens when someone threatens family." Family. The word settled over Emily like something warm and solid, something she hadn't realized she'd been desperately missing for longer than she wanted to admit. She had walked into this bar 6 weeks ago as a desperate stranger nobody wanted to hire. Tonight, for the first time, she understood that somewhere along the way, without either side fully realizing when it happened, she had stopped being a stranger at all. But as Emily looked toward the door one last time, toward the darkness outside where Daniel Cross had disappeared into the desert night, she couldn't shake the cold certainty settling in her chest. This was only the beginning. And whatever Daniel was planning next, it was going to be far worse than anything that had happened tonight. Jackson didn't sleep that night. By the time the sun came up over the desert, he'd already made 4 phone calls, pulled every scrap of public information he could find on Daniel Cross, and printed out a stack of documents that sat waiting on the bar. When Emily walked in for her morning shift, her eyes still puffy from a night spent staring at her ceiling instead of resting. You look terrible, Jackson said, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter toward her. Thanks, Emily said dryly, wrapping both hands around the mug like it was the only warm thing left in her world. Really building my confidence over here. I mean it as a compliment, Jackson said. You look terrible because you didn't run. Most people who go through what happened last night pack a bag and disappear by morning. I thought about it, Emily admitted. Around 3 a.m., I had my hand on my suitcase. What stopped you? Emily wrapped her fingers tighter around the mug. I got tired of running. I've been running from Daniel for over a year. I'm done letting him decide where I sleep at night. Jackson studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his dark eyes, and then he slid the stack of papers toward her. Then you're going to want to see this. Emily set down her coffee and flipped through the pages, her stomach twisting tighter with every line. Daniel Cross wasn't just a wealthy businessman with a nice suit and a manipulative streak. He was the founder and majority owner of Cross Capital Holdings, a private investment firm with offices in 3 states, a man whose name showed up in local business journals with alarming regularity. A man who sat on the boards of 2 different charities that made him look on paper like a pillar of the community. He's got money, Emily said quietly. Real money, more than I ever understood when we were together. He's got something else too, Jackson said, tapping one particular page. Lawsuits, 3 of them filed by former employees over the last 6 years. 2 settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. 1 still pending. Emily's eyes scanned the brief court summary, her hands going cold. What kind of lawsuits? Harassment, Jackson said flatly. Intimidation. One former assistant claimed he had private investigators following her for months after she quit trying to dig up something he could use to keep her quiet about what she saw inside that office. Emily's breath caught. That's exactly the kind of thing he'd do. So you understand, Jackson said, that when he said this isn't over last night, he probably meant it literally. Emily set the papers down, her hands trembling slightly despite her best efforts to hide it. What do I do? Jackson leaned against the bar arms, crossed his expression unreadable, in the way Emily was slowly learning, meant he was thinking carefully before speaking. First thing you do is call a lawyer. Not one of his lawyers, not somebody he can buy off, somebody local, somebody who doesn't owe him anything. Raymond already put a call into somebody he trusts. I can't afford a lawyer, Emily said, embarrassment creeping into her voice. Nobody said you're paying for it, Jackson said simply, like the matter was already closed. Emily opened her mouth to argue, some old instinct rising up in her. The same instinct that had made her feel guilty for every meal Daniel bought, every gift, every reminder that she was somehow in his debt for simply existing in his orbit. But she stopped herself because this didn't feel like that. This didn't feel like a transaction with strings attached. This felt like something else entirely. Why are you all doing this for me? Emily asked quietly. I've worked here 6 weeks. I'm nobody to you. Jackson's expression shifted, something almost gentle passing across his features before the hardness returned. You stopped being nobody the day Raymond decided you weren't. That's how it works around here. Took me a long time to understand that myself. Before Emily could ask what he meant by that, the second time he'd hinted at some history he never fully explained, the bar door swung open and Raymond walked in, phone pressed to his ear, his expression tight with barely restrained anger. Yeah, Raymond said into the phone. Yeah, I understand. Just tell me if it's legitimate or if he's bluffing. A pause. All right, thanks, Marcus. I owe you one. He hung up and looked at Emily, his jaw set in a hard line. That was the lawyer, Raymond said. He looked at the documents Daniel's people sent over this morning. Emily's stomach dropped. This morning he already sent something. Emailed straight to the bar's business account somehow, Raymond said, sliding his phone across the counter so Emily could see the message. Guess he did his research on where you work. Emily's hands shook as she read the email, her eyes catching fragments: breach of financial agreement, joint investment obligations, repayment demanded within 30 days, legal action to follow the words blurring together into a wall of intimidation dressed up in professional language. This is insane, Emily said, her voice rising. I never signed anything like this. I never agreed to any joint investment. Marcus says the signature on the document doesn't look right, Raymond said. Says it's possible, not certain, but possible it's forged or at least manipulated somehow. He wants copies of any documents you have from your relationship with Cross. Bank statements, emails, anything that shows the real financial picture. I have some things, Emily said slowly, her mind racing back to boxes she'd left behind at her old apartment files she'd been too afraid to properly organize because looking at them meant remembering things she wanted to forget. Not everything. I left most of it behind when I left him. I was scared he'd know if things were missing. Then we go get them, Jackson said immediately. Emily blinked. What? You said you left things behind. Bank statements, records, whatever might help prove he's lying about this joint investment nonsense. If it's still at your old place, we go get it. I can't just walk back into that house, Emily said, panic rising sharp and sudden in her chest. He'll know. You're not walking in alone, Jackson said, his voice steady, certain the kind of certainty that made Emily's racing heart slow just slightly. You're not walking in at all if you don't want to. Just tell us where to look. Raymond nodded in agreement. Give us the address. Give us anything specific we should be looking for. We'll handle the rest. Emily stared at both men, something overwhelming rising in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. Not quite gratitude, not quite disbelief. Something that felt like the ground shifting slightly beneath her feet in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. You'd really do that, she asked quietly. Just because I asked. You didn't ask, Raymond pointed out. We offered. Same thing, Jackson added, when it matters. Emily felt tears threatening again, and she blinked them back hard, unwilling to fall apart in the middle of the bar during business hours, unwilling to let herself feel too much relief before she understood what it would cost. There's a lockbox, she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected, hidden in the floorboard of the walk-in closet in the guest bedroom. Daniel never knew about it. I hid documents there over the last year slowly whenever I got the chance because some part of me always suspected I might need proof someday of what our finances actually look like. Smart, Raymond said, something like approval in his voice. There should be bank statements in there, Emily continued. Emails I printed out. A journal I kept, though I don't know if that'll help or just make me look. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Make you look like a woman documenting abuse because she was scared and had no one else to tell. Jackson finished for her, his voice quiet but firm. That's not weakness, Emily. That's survival instinct. Don't apologize for it. Emily swallowed hard against the lump forming in her throat and gave them the address. 2 hours later, while Emily nervously wiped down the same section of bar 3 times over, unable to focus on anything except the agonizing wait, Jackson and 2 other club members returned, carrying a small metal lockbox and a manila folder stuffed thick with papers. Got it, Jackson said, setting everything down carefully on the bar in front of her. House was empty, in and out clean. Did anyone see you? Emily asked, immediately panic flaring. Cameras caught us, Jackson admitted, but we're not worried about that. This is still legally your former residence too, according to the lease you showed Marcus. You had every right to retrieve your own belongings. Emily's hands trembled as she opened the lockbox, pulling out bank statements. She remembered hiding one by one over months of careful planning printed emails, documenting Daniel's controlling behavior, and finally at the bottom a worn leather journal she hadn't touched in over a year. She opened it to a random page and immediately regretted it, her own handwriting, from over a year ago, staring back at her, documenting a night Daniel had screamed at her for nearly 2 hours because she'd rearranged furniture in the living room without asking his permission first. She closed it quickly, her face flushing with an old familiar shame. Hey, Jackson said softly, noticing her expression. Whatever's in there, it's not something to be ashamed of. It's evidence. It's proof of exactly the kind of man he really is underneath all that money and charm. I know that logically, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it still feels humiliating. Writing all that down because I was too scared to say it out loud to anybody. You survived him, Raymond said, joining the conversation, his voice carrying that same steady certainty Emily had come to rely on over the past 6 weeks. That journal isn't proof you were weak. It's proof you were smart enough to protect yourself even when you had nobody else protecting you. Emily nodded slowly, unable to fully accept the words yet, but grateful for them regardless. We'll get this to Marcus today, Raymond said, gathering the documents carefully. In the meantime, you're not staying alone tonight. Emily blinked. What? Daniel knows where you work now. If he's desperate enough to forge documents, he might be desperate enough to try something at your apartment too, Raymond said. You're staying somewhere safe until we know exactly what we're dealing with. I don't want to be a burden, Emily started, but Raymond cut her off with a look that brooked no argument. You're not a burden. You're club business now, whether you like the sound of that or not. And club business gets protected. Emily didn't know what to say to that, so she simply nodded, feeling the weight of the day finally settling over her shoulders like an exhaustion she hadn't allowed herself to feel until this exact moment. She ended up staying in a small spare room above the bar that night, a space normally used for storage that Tiny and two other members cleared out within an hour, hauling in a mattress and blankets, with a level of efficiency that made Emily suspect this wasn't the first time the club had needed to make quick arrangements for someone in trouble. She lay awake that night listening to the muffled sound of voices below the low hum of conversation from men she'd known for less than 2 months, who had without hesitation rearranged their entire evening to make sure she felt safe. She thought about Daniel, about the forged documents, about the calculated cruelty of a man who would rather destroy someone's life than accept rejection. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her that for the first time since she'd left him, she wasn't facing this fight alone. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Emily was helping Doc restock the bar's liquor shelves when Raymond's phone rang, his expression shifting from casual to sharp and focused within seconds of answering. "Say that again," he said into the phone, his voice tight. Emily froze a bottle of whiskey, suspended halfway to the shelf, watching Raymond's face for any clue about what was happening. "When?" Raymond asked. A pause. "All right, we'll be there." He hung up and turned to Emily, his expression grim. "That was Marcus," Raymond said. "Daniel filed for an emergency restraining order against you this morning." Emily nearly dropped the bottle in her hands. "Against me? He's the one who came here, who threatened me, who forged documents. He's claiming you've been harassing him." Raymond said, disgust evident in his voice. "Says you sent threatening messages, that you've been showing up near his office, that you're," and I'm quoting Marcus, quoting the filing here, "engaging in a pattern of stalking behavior consistent with obsessive attachment following the end of the relationship." Emily felt the room tilt slightly beneath her feet. "That's insane. That's completely backwards from what actually happened." "I know," Raymond said. "Marcus knows too. But a judge doesn't know that yet, not until we prove it. There's a hearing scheduled for Friday morning." 3 days, Emily whispered. 3 days to build a case that shows exactly what kind of man Daniel Cross really is, Raymond confirmed. "The good news is we've got the journal, the bank statements, the emails. Marcus thinks it's enough to not just fight the restraining order, but potentially file countercharges." "And the bad news?" Emily asked, already sensing there was more. Raymond's jaw tightened. "The bad news is Daniel's got money and connections in this county that we don't have. Judge assigned to the case has ruled in favor of Cross Capital in 2 separate business disputes over the last 5 years. Doesn't mean he's corrupt necessarily, but it does mean we're not walking into a level playing field." Emily's hands were shaking now, the fragile confidence she'd built over the past 6 weeks threatening to crack under the weight of legal terminology and looming deadlines. "What if I lose?" she asked quietly. "What if the restraining order goes through? What happens to me?" Jackson, who had been listening silently from across the bar, finally spoke. "Then we appeal. Then we fight harder. Then we make sure every piece of evidence in that journal, every threatening email, every red flag you documented over 5 years gets put in front of every judge in this county until somebody with a conscience actually looks at the truth." "That could take months," Emily said. "Years, maybe." "Then it takes years," Jackson said simply. "You didn't survive 5 years with that man just to lose to him in a courtroom because we ran out of patience." Emily looked between Jackson and Raymond, feeling something steady settling in her chest despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "Okay," she said finally. "What do we do first?" The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Marcus, the lawyer Raymond trusted, turned out to be a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Marcus Webb, who Emily quickly learned had built her entire career representing clients that bigger, flashier law firms wouldn't touch: abuse survivors, whistleblowers, people fighting against opponents with far more money and far more power than they had. "I've seen men like Daniel Cross before," Marcus told Emily during their first in-person meeting, spreading documents across a conference table in her modest downtown office. "They rely on 2 things, money and intimidation. Take away their ability to intimidate you, and their money becomes a lot less effective." "How do I take away his ability to intimidate me?" Emily asked. "I still feel sick every time I think about facing him in court." "By telling the truth," Marcus said simply. "Every detail, every incident, every moment he made you feel small, controlled, afraid. Judges see through performative confidence. What they respond to is authenticity. And authenticity means being willing to admit you were scared, that you're still scared, and that you're standing up anyway. Emily spent the following 2 days working with Marcus, going through every page of the journal, cross-referencing dates with bank statements, building a timeline that painted a devastating picture of exactly how Daniel had systematically isolated and controlled her over 5 years. Raymond and Jackson accompanied her to every meeting, sitting quietly in the back of Marcus's office, present, but never intrusive, a silent reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. On Wednesday evening, exhausted after another long session with Marcus, Emily sat at the bar nursing a glass of water, staring blankly at the wood grain of the counter when Jackson slid onto the stool beside her. "You've been quiet," he observed. "I keep thinking about Friday," Emily admitted, "about having to sit in the same room as him again, about having to relive every terrible thing that happened between us out loud in front of strangers." "You don't have to do it alone," Jackson reminded her. "I know," Emily said. "That's actually the part that surprises me most. 6 weeks ago, I didn't have anyone. Now I've got an entire motorcycle club preparing for war on my behalf." She let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "This is not how I expected my life to look right now." "Life rarely goes how we expect," Jackson said, something distant entering his voice. Emily glanced at him, noticing again that flicker of hidden history she'd caught glimpses of before. "You keep hinting that you understand what I'm going through. The controlling relationship, I mean. The fear." Jackson was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands resting on the bar. "I wasn't always in this club," he said finally, his voice low. "Before this life, I was married. Young, stupid, thought I knew everything about love." He paused, jaw tightening slightly. "She wasn't like Daniel, not exactly. Different kind of control. But the effect was the same. Made me feel like nothing without her, made me isolate from everyone who cared about me, made me believe leaving would be the worst mistake of my life." "What happened?" Emily asked softly. "Took me 4 years to leave," Jackson said. 4 years of convincing myself it wasn't that bad, that I was overreacting, that everybody has hard relationships, and I just needed to try harder." He looked up, meeting Emily's eyes directly. "Raymond's the one who finally got through to me. Told me the same thing he told you. That real strength isn't staying and taking it. Real strength is walking away even when everything in you is terrified of what comes after." Emily felt something shift in her understanding of Jackson, the cold, guarded exterior finally making a different kind of sense. "That's why you didn't trust me at first," she said quietly. "Not because you thought I was dangerous. Because you recognized something in my story that reminded you of your own." Jackson nodded slowly. "Didn't want to watch somebody else go through what I went through. Didn't want to get close to someone who might still be too scared to actually leave for good, who might go crawling back the moment things got hard." "I'm not going back to him," Emily said firmly, "no matter what happens Friday." "I believe you," Jackson said, and something in his tone made it clear he genuinely meant it. "Didn't at first, do now." The moment stretched between them, warmer than Emily expected, filled with an understanding that went beyond simple workplace camaraderie. Then Jackson cleared his throat and stood up abruptly, the walls sliding back into place. "Get some sleep," he said. "Friday's going to be a long day." Emily watched him walk away, feeling something complicated blooming in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Friday morning arrived faster than Emily was prepared for. She stood outside the county courthouse in a borrowed blazer Marcus had lent her, her hands ice cold despite the desert heat already building around them, flanked by Raymond and Jackson, with Tiny and Doc standing a respectful distance behind a silent show of support that made Emily's throat tighten with emotion. "You ready?" Raymond asked. "No," Emily admitted honestly, "but I'm going in anyway." Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than Emily expected, sterile and formal, in a way that made her stomach churn with anxiety. Daniel sat at the opposite table, impeccably dressed, as always, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they cost more per hour than Emily made in a month. He didn't look at her directly, but Emily caught the small, confident smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the smile of a man who had never once believed he could lose. The hearing began with Daniel's legal team presenting their case, painting Emily as an unstable former partner, struggling to accept the end of a relationship, citing carefully worded messages that Emily immediately recognized as selectively edited screenshots taken completely out of context. "These messages," Daniel's lead attorney said, gesturing toward a printed exhibit, clearly demonstrate a pattern of obsessive behavior. Objection, Marcus interrupted smoothly. Those messages are incomplete. I have the full conversation thread here, which shows a very different context. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, gestured for Marcus to approach. What followed was nearly an hour of methodical, devastating rebuttal as Marcus presented full message threads showing Emily desperately trying to retrieve her own belongings, financial records showing Daniel's threatening emails about the fabricated joint investment, and finally portions of Emily's journal read aloud in Emily's own trembling voice, documenting years of controlled, isolated fear. Emily watched Daniel's confident expression falter. With each new piece of evidence, watched his lawyers exchange increasingly worried glances, watched the carefully constructed narrative he'd built begin to crumble in real time. Mr. Cross, the judge said finally, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the entire courtroom. I've reviewed the evidence presented today, and I have serious concerns about the veracity of your initial filing. The pattern described in Ms. Carter's documentation, combined with the questionable circumstances surrounding this alleged joint investment agreement, suggests this restraining order request may have been filed in bad faith. Emily's heart pounded so loud she was sure everyone in the courtroom could hear it. I'm denying the emergency restraining order, the judge continued. Furthermore, given the evidence of potential document forgery presented today, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for further investigation. The courtroom erupted into quiet murmurs. Daniel's face had gone pale, his composed mask finally cracking, entirely revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. This is ridiculous, Daniel said, rising from his seat, his voice sharp with barely controlled fury. Your Honor, this is... Sit down, Mr. Cross. The judge said sharply, before you say something that adds contempt of court to your growing list of problems. Daniel sat, his jaw clenched so tight Emily could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. For the first time in 5 years, Emily watched the man who had once controlled every aspect of her life look genuinely, completely powerless. The hearing concluded shortly after, and Emily walked out of that courtroom into blinding desert sunlight, her legs shaking so badly she nearly stumbled, immediately caught by Jackson's steady hand at her elbow. You did it, Raymond said, pride evident in his voice. You actually did it. We did it, Emily corrected, tears finally spilling over, tears of relief rather than sadness. I couldn't have gotten through any of that without all of you. Behind them, Daniel emerged from the courthouse with his lawyers, his expression thunderous, his eyes finding Emily across the parking lot with an intensity that sent a fresh chill down her spine, despite the victory they'd just secured. He didn't approach. He didn't say anything. He simply stared at her for a long, cold moment, then got into his car and drove away, tires screeching slightly against the pavement. This isn't over, Emily said quietly, echoing Daniel's own words from that first confrontation in the bar. Is it? Jackson's expression darkened. No, he admitted. Probably not. Men like him don't lose gracefully, Raymond added. But today we bought ourselves time. Time to build a stronger case. Time to make sure whatever he tries next, we're ready for it. Emily nodded, wiping the tears from her face, trying to hold on to the victory they'd just won, even as a familiar dread settled back into her stomach. That night, the entire bar erupted into an impromptu celebration, Tiny insisting on buying rounds for everyone. Doc pulling out an old bottle of good whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion, the jukebox playing louder than usual as the entire club toasted to Emily's victory. For the first time since Daniel Cross had walked back into her life, Emily allowed herself to relax, surrounded by people who had, in the span of a few short months, become something she'd stopped believing was possible. A family that chose her not because they had to, but because they wanted to. But even as she laughed at Tiny's terrible jokes and accepted Doc's warm fatherly hug, even as she caught Jackson watching her from across the room with an expression she still hadn't fully deciphered, Emily couldn't quite shake the cold certainty settling beneath her relief. Daniel Cross had just been publicly humiliated in a courtroom, his reputation and his freedom now hanging by a thread pending investigation. And men like Daniel, when cornered, when exposed, when stripped of the polished mask they wore for the rest of the world, didn't simply walk away. They struck back, harder, colder, and far more dangerous than anyone in that celebrating bar could possibly anticipate. The call came in at 2 a.m, and Emily would remember for the rest of her life the exact sound it made cutting through the darkness of the small room above the bar. Her phone buzzing against the nightstand, insistent, relentless. She fumbled for it, half asleep, squinting at a number she didn't recognize, and something instinctive in her chest told her not to answer. She answered anyway. "Emily Carter," a woman's voice asked, brisk and professional. "Yes," Emily said, sitting up now, every nerve suddenly alert. "Who is this?" "This is Detective Ramirez with the County Sheriff's Department. I'm sorry to call so late, but I need to ask you some questions regarding an incident tonight involving a Daniel Cross." Emily's blood went cold. "Is he all right? Did something happen to him?" There was a pause on the other end, a pause that lasted just long enough to make Emily's heart hammer against her ribs. "Mr. Cross's vehicle was found abandoned about 10 miles outside town," the detective said carefully. "There's evidence of a struggle. We're treating this as a possible assault, maybe worse. Given the restraining order dispute earlier this week, we need to know your whereabouts tonight." Emily nearly dropped the phone. "I've been here," she said, her voice shaking. "At the bar. I haven't left the building since my shift ended at 10. There are at least a dozen witnesses." "We're going to need to verify that," the detective said. "Someone will be by in the morning to take a formal statement." The call ended, and Emily sat frozen in the dark, her mind racing through 100 terrifying possibilities at once. She didn't wait until morning. She was down the stairs and pounding on Raymond's office door. Within minutes, her bare feet cold against the old wooden floor, her hands still trembling from the phone call. Raymond opened the door, already half-dressed, alert, in the way of a man who'd spent decades learning to wake instantly at the first sign of trouble. "What happened?" he asked. Emily told him everything, in the words tumbling out faster than she could organize them, and she watched Raymond's expression shift from concern to something harder, something calculating. "They think you did this," Raymond said slowly. "I didn't do anything," Emily said, panic rising in her voice. "I was here all night. You know I was here." "I know that," Raymond said firmly, "and so does every single person who was in this bar tonight. That's not the problem." "Then what is—" Raymond's jaw tightened. "The problem is a man like Daniel Cross doesn't just disappear without somebody wanting it to look exactly like what it looks like right now. Somebody wanted the timing to line up perfectly with your restraining order hearing. Somebody wanted the first name detectives think of to be yours." The weight of his words settled over Emily like ice water. "You think somebody set me up?" she whispered. "I think," Raymond said carefully, "that we need Marcus on the phone before that detective shows up in the morning. And I think you need to tell us everything you know about anyone who might want to see you take the fall for whatever happened to Daniel tonight." By 6 in the morning, the bar had transformed into something resembling a war room. Marcus arrived first, her expression grim, but focused, immediately instructing Emily on exactly what she could and couldn't say to investigators. Jackson arrived 20 minutes later, having driven straight from wherever he'd spent the night, his expression darker than Emily had ever seen it. "I checked the security footage from outside the bar," Jackson said, setting a laptop down on the counter. "Cameras cover the parking lot and the front entrance. Emily's truck never moved last night. Not once from the moment she parked it after her shift until right now." "That helps," Marcus said, "but it's not enough on its own. The detective is going to want more than security footage from a location Emily has obvious access to and could theoretically manipulate." "I don't know how to manipulate security footage," Emily said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I barely know how to use the register half the time." "I know that," Marcus said gently, "but a suspicious detective doesn't know that yet, and it's her job to be suspicious until proven otherwise." Detective Ramirez arrived at 8 sharp, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who studied Emily with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. She sat across from Emily at one of the bar's back tables, Marcus beside her, and began asking questions in a calm, methodical voice that somehow felt more intimidating than if she'd been aggressive from the start. "Walk me through your relationship with Daniel Cross," the detective said. Emily did, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach, describing 5 years of control and manipulation, the restraining order. Hearing 3 days earlier, the forged documents, the way Daniel had accused her of stalking, when the truth was almost entirely reversed. "You understand," Detective Ramirez said, "that a man humiliated in court 3 days before he disappears under suspicious circumstances creates a fairly compelling narrative pointing directly at you." "I understand how it looks," Emily said. "But I didn't touch him. I haven't spoken to him since the courthouse. I've been terrified of him for over a year, not the other way around." She's telling the truth, Jackson said, stepping forward from where he'd been standing near the bar. I can vouch for her whereabouts. So can at least 8 other people who were here last night. Detective Ramirez's eyes moved to Jackson, assessing him the way she'd assessed Emily, missing nothing. And you are Jackson Reed, he said. I work here. Convenient, the detective said, that everyone at this establishment seems ready to vouch for Ms. Carter's alibi. It's not convenient, Raymond interjected, his voice carrying that same low authority Emily had come to recognize. It's the truth. We were all here. You're welcome to interview every single person individually if that's what it takes to convince you. The detective studied Raymond for a long moment and then nodded slowly. I intend to. Over the next several hours, Detective Ramirez interviewed nearly everyone who had been present at the bar the previous night. Tiny Doc, 3 other members who had been playing cards near the pool table until well past midnight, even a customer who wasn't part of the club at all, but had stayed late nursing a beer and watching the game on the old television mounted above the bar. Every single account matched. Every timeline lined up exactly with what Emily had told her. By early afternoon, the detective's rigid posture had softened just slightly, though her expression remained carefully neutral. Your alibi checks out, she said, finally closing her notebook. For now, you're not a suspect, but I need you to understand something, Miss Carter. Whoever did this to Daniel Cross either wanted it to look exactly like a crime of passion committed by a scorned woman or Emily prompted when the detective paused. Or Daniel Cross wanted it to look that way himself, Detective Ramirez said. We haven't ruled out the possibility that this entire disappearance was staged. The room fell silent. Staged, Emily repeated. Why would he stage his own disappearance? Men facing serious financial fraud investigations sometimes find creative ways to delay legal proceedings, the detective said, especially men who suddenly find themselves referred to the district attorney's office for document forgery 3 days before they vanish. Emily felt a strange mixture of relief and fresh dread settle over her at that possibility. If Daniel had staged this, if he was somewhere safe, planning his next move while everyone believed he was the victim of a violent crime, that meant this nightmare was far from over. If someone else had actually hurt him, that possibility was even more terrifying because it meant somebody dangerous enough to make a wealthy, well-connected man simply disappear was now circling somewhere close to Emily's own life. We'll be in touch as the investigation progresses, Detective Ramirez said, standing to leave. In the meantime, Ms. Carter, I'd suggest staying somewhere you feel safe and keeping detailed records of your whereabouts going forward. After the detective left, the bar fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of everything that had just happened settling heavily over the room. What if he really did stage this? Emily asked quietly, breaking the silence. What if this is just another way to control the narrative, to make people doubt me, to keep me looking over my shoulder for months while he hides somewhere pulling strings? Then we keep doing exactly what we've been doing, Raymond said. We stay one step ahead of him, we keep documenting everything, and we make sure that wherever he's hiding, he understands there's nowhere he can go where this club won't eventually find the truth. Jackson had been unusually quiet throughout the entire ordeal, his expression distant, calculating the way Emily had learned meant he was working through something complicated in his mind. Jackson, she asked, what is it? Something's bothering me, he admitted. Ramirez said his car was found 10 miles outside town, evidence of a struggle. If Daniel staged this himself, that's a level of physical evidence hard to fake convincingly enough to fool trained investigators. Meaning what? Emily asked. Meaning maybe somebody actually did hurt him, Jackson said slowly. And if that's true, we need to figure out who before whoever it is decides they're not finished. That night, unable to sleep despite pure exhaustion, weighing down every muscle in her body, Emily found herself sitting alone at the bar long after closing, staring at nothing in particular, replaying every detail of the past week in her mind. She didn't hear Jackson approach until he was already sliding onto the stool beside her. Can't sleep either, he asked. Too much running through my head, Emily admitted. Every time I close my eyes, I keep thinking about that courtroom, about the way Daniel looked at me right before he drove off. Like he wasn't done, like whatever came next was going to be worse. You think he's really gone? Jackson asked. I don't know what to think anymore, Emily said honestly. Part of me wants to believe somebody finally made him face consequences for everything he's done to people. Part of me is terrified this is just another manipulation, another way to make me feel guilty and scared and trapped. even when he's not physically in the room. Jackson was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression that made Emily's heart beat a little faster despite everything else weighing on her mind. For what it's worth, when he said finally, whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone. I know I said that before, but I need you to actually believe it, not just hear the words. I'm starting to, Emily admitted quietly. That's honestly the strangest part of this entire situation. 6 weeks ago, I trusted absolutely nobody. Now the people I trust most in this world all wear leather vests and ride motorcycles. A small, genuine smile broke across Jackson's face, the first one Emily had seen from him in days. Life's funny like that sometimes, he said. Their eyes met, and for a moment something passed between them that had nothing to do with fear or investigation or the looming threat of Daniel Cross. Something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The moment was shattered by the sudden sharp sound of breaking glass from somewhere outside. Jackson was on his feet instantly, every muscle in his body shifting into immediate alertness, moving toward the front window before Emily even fully processed what had happened. Stay here, he said, his voice hard, at all traces of softness gone. Emily didn't listen. She followed him toward the door, her heart pounding, just in time to see a dark figure sprinting away from the parking lot into the desert darkness and too far and too fast to identify. What happened? She asked, breathless. Jackson knelt beside her, her truck examining something on the ground, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. Somebody broke your driver's side window, he said, and left this. He held up a folded piece of paper, and Emily's hands shook as she took it from him, unfolding it with dread pooling in her stomach. There were only 3 words written across the page in handwriting she didn't recognize but somehow instantly understood. Your next sweetheart. The paper felt like it was burning in her hands. That's not Daniel's handwriting, Emily whispered. No, Jackson agreed grimly, already scanning the darkness around them. It's not. Which meant whoever had actually made Daniel Cross disappear wasn't finished. And now they had made it terrifyingly, unmistakably clear that Emily was their next target. Raymond called an emergency meeting within the hour. Every available club member gathering in the back room of the bar, the atmosphere thick with tension that hadn't existed even during the height of the restraining order battle. We need to consider the possibility, Raymond said grimly, that whoever's behind this isn't connected to Daniel at all. Or worse, that they are, and this is exactly the kind of chaos somebody wants us distracted by while they finish whatever business they started. What business? Emily asked. I don't understand what anyone would want from me beyond what Daniel already tried. Maybe it's not about you specifically, Jackson said slowly, his mind clearly working through angles Emily hadn't considered. Maybe it's about making sure you stay too scared to keep digging into whatever Daniel was really involved in. What do you mean? Emily asked. Jackson pulled out the folder Marcus had compiled during the restraining order case, flipping through pages until he found what he was looking for. Those pending lawsuits I found. The harassment claims, the private investigator allegations. What if there's more to Daniel's business than just controlling relationships? What if Cross Capital Holdings has been covering up something a lot more dangerous than personal cruelty? Emily felt a chill run down her spine as pieces started clicking into place. You think Daniel's disappearance is connected to something with his company, something bigger than me. I think, Jackson said carefully, that you might have accidentally stumbled into something during your relationship that you didn't even realize it was significant, something that made you dangerous to more people than just Daniel. Like what? You lived with him for 5 years, Jackson said. You had access to his home, his private conversations, maybe his private files. Did you ever see anything that seemed strange? Financial documents that didn't make sense. Meetings with people who seemed uncomfortable or secretive. Emily's mind raced back through years of memories she'd tried desperately to forget. Memories tangled up with fear and manipulation and control, but now forcing herself to think clearly, to separate the emotional trauma from the practical details, something surfaced that she'd never thought twice about at the time. There was a man, she said slowly, came to the house maybe 4 or 5 times over the years, always late at night. Daniel always made me stay upstairs, told me it was business I didn't need to worry about. But I remember hearing raised voices sometimes. Once I heard the word evidence clearly through the floor, and Daniel telling this man that everything was handled, that nobody would ever find out. The room went completely silent. Do you remember what this man looked like? Raymond asked. Tall, Emily said, concentrating hard. Dark hair, expensive suit like Daniel's. I only saw him clearly once when I came downstairs for water and he was leaving. He had a scar right here. She touched her own eyebrow. Small but noticeable. Did Daniel ever say a name? Jackson pressed. Emily closed her eyes, forcing herself back into memories she'd spent months trying to bury. Once, she said finally, I heard Daniel call him Victor, just once in passing. Marcus, who had remained quiet throughout most of this exchange, suddenly straightened in her seat. Victor, she repeated. Emily, I need you to think very carefully. Was it possibly Victor Sokolov? Emily blinked, surprised by the immediate recognition in Marcus's voice. I don't know his last name. Why do you know him? Marcus's expression had gone pale. Victor Sokolov is under federal investigation for running a massive financial fraud scheme, money laundering primarily using legitimate businesses as fronts to clean money from considerably less legitimate sources. If Daniel Cross was working with him, actively hiding evidence for him, that would explain everything. Explain what Emily asked, though dread was already building in her chest, anticipating the answer before Marcus even said it. It would explain why Daniel disappeared right after being referred to the district attorney's office, Marcus said. Not because of the forgery charges related to you necessarily, but because that referral might have triggered a deeper look into his business dealings. And if Victor Sokolov's people found out Daniel was suddenly under increased scrutiny, suddenly vulnerable to investigators looking for any reason to make a deal, they'd make sure he couldn't talk, Jackson finished grimly. The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. This wasn't about a scorned relationship anymore. This wasn't even entirely about Daniel Cross's personal cruelty toward Emily. This was about a woman who had unknowingly witnessed fragments of a massive criminal conspiracy, fragments dangerous enough that somebody was now willing to threaten her life to make sure she stayed silent. I need to call the FBI, Marcus said, already reaching for her phone. Emily, whatever fragments of information you have, however small they seem, they could be critically important to an active federal investigation. And if the FBI gets involved, Raymond said, his voice hardening with protective instinct, that puts an even bigger target on Emily's back before we have adequate protection in place. We don't have a choice, Marcus said firmly. If this really is connected to Sokolov's organization, hiding from federal authorities isn't protecting Emily. It's leaving her exposed to people with far more resources and far less mercy than anything Daniel Cross was capable of on his own. Emily sat frozen in the middle of the room, listening to grown adults discuss federal investigations and criminal conspiracies as though her entire life hadn't just been turned upside down by 3 sentences of information she hadn't even realized she was carrying. This can't be happening, she whispered. Jackson knelt beside her chair, his expression softer now, though the tension in his body remained coiled tight. Hey, he said gently, look at me. Emily met his eyes, tears threatening, despite her best efforts to hold them back. You didn't ask for any of this, Jackson said. None of it is your fault, but you're strong enough to face it just like you faced Daniel in that courtroom. And this time you're not just facing one man's cruelty. You've got an entire federal investigation potentially backing you up, along with every single person in this club standing between you and anyone stupid enough to try hurting you again. Promise me something, Emily said quietly. Anything. Promise you won't let them use me as bait. Promise that whatever happens next, I don't become some kind of sacrifice to catch bigger criminals. Jackson's jaw tightened, something fierce and protective flashing across his features. I promise, he said firmly. Nobody uses you for anything. We protect you first. Everything else comes second. Raymond, overhearing this exchange, nodded in firm agreement. Jackson's right. Whatever the FBI wants to do with this information, Emily's safety comes before their investigation. That's not negotiable. Marcus made the call that evening, and within 24 hours, 2 federal agents arrived at the Vulture's Roost, their presence transforming the familiar bar into something that felt almost surreal, government suits mixing incongruously among leather vests and motorcycle patches. Agent Sarah Chen, a sharp-focused woman who reminded Emily somewhat of Detective Ramirez, led the questioning, her partner taking careful notes throughout. Ms. Carter, Agent Chen said, everything you tell us today could be instrumental in building a case against an organization responsible for laundering potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. But I need you to understand something clearly before we proceed. What's that? Emily asked, her voice steadier than she felt. If Victor Sokolov's organization believes you possess information dangerous to their operation, The threat against your life doesn't disappear just because you cooperate with us, Agent Chen said bluntly. In some cases, cooperation increases the immediate danger, at least until we're able to build a strong enough case to make arrests. So what am I supposed to do? Emily asked. Stay silent and hope whoever's threatening me eventually loses interest. No, Agent Chen said. We're offering federal protection, a safe house, new identity documentation if necessary, complete relocation while the investigation proceeds. Emily's stomach dropped. You mean leave? Leave everything, everyone, start over completely somewhere else. It's the safest option available, Agent Chen said. Emily looked around the room at Raymond's steady presence, at Jackson's fierce protectiveness, at Tiny and Doc standing near the doorway with expressions of genuine concern on their weathered faces. In just 8 weeks, these people had become the only real family she had left. The first people in years who had made her feel valued rather than controlled, protected rather than possessed. I don't want to disappear, Emily said firmly, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. I just found people who actually care about me. I'm not running away from that to hide in some government safe house for months, maybe years, with no idea when or if it'll ever be safe to come back. Ms. Carter, I understand this is difficult, but your safety, my safety, Emily interrupted, has been my responsibility for longer than you probably realize, Agent Chen. I survived 5 years with a man who tried to convince me I couldn't survive without him. I'm not about to let fear convince me I have to disappear completely just because dangerous men exist in this world. Raymond stepped forward, then his presence immediately commanding attention. There's another option, he said. Agent Chen turned to him, skeptical. And what option is that? She stays here, Raymond said simply, under our protection. This club has resources you might not fully appreciate, Agent. We've got members with law enforcement backgrounds, military backgrounds, security and expertise built over decades. We can keep her safer here than any temporary safe house ever could, and she doesn't have to sacrifice the only support system she has left. Agent Chen studied Raymond for a long moment, clearly weighing options that fell outside typical federal protocol. This isn't standard procedure, she said finally. Neither is expecting a trauma survivor to abandon everything she's rebuilt because dangerous men made threats, Raymond countered. We're not asking permission, Agent Chen. We're informing you that Emily has people who will protect her with or without federal cooperation. The question is whether you'd rather work with us or against us while building your case. After a tense silence, Agent Chen finally nodded, though her expression remained cautious. We'll need regular check-ins, security assessments, and Emily, I need you to understand this arrangement comes with serious risk that a federal safe house would minimize significantly. I understand the risk, Emily said. I'm choosing to face it here with people I trust rather than running away to somewhere unfamiliar and alone. As the federal agents prepared to leave, Agent Chen paused at the door, looking back at Emily with an expression that held something close to genuine respect. For what it's worth, she said, Viktor Sokolov's organization has left a trail of people too frightened to testify against them for years. You're the first person connected to this case who's chosen to stand and fight instead of simply disappearing. I'm tired of disappearing, Emily said quietly. I spent 5 years making myself smaller, quieter, less visible, hoping it would keep me safe. It never did. Maybe standing my ground is the only thing that actually will. After the agents left, the bar fell into a heavy contemplative silence, everyone processing the magnitude of what they'd just agreed to take on. This is going to get more dangerous, Raymond said, finally addressing the room. Whoever's working for Sokolov, whoever left that note on Emily's truck, they're not going to simply give up because federal agents got involved. If anything, this raises the stakes considerably. Then we raise our defenses to match, Jackson said firmly. 24-hour security rotation. Nobody goes anywhere alone, especially Emily. We treat this like exactly what it is, a war, even if it doesn't look like one yet. Over the following days, the Vulture's ruse transformed subtly but unmistakably. Security cameras were installed covering every angle of the parking lot and entrance. Club members took shifts, ensuring Emily was never left alone, whether at the bar or during the rare moments she left the building for necessary errands. Doc, despite his health concerns, insisted on teaching Emily basic self-defense techniques during quiet afternoon hours, his trembling hands steadying with surprising precision whenever he demonstrated a move. Your body remembers what your mind forgets under pressure, Doc told her during one session, patiently correcting her stance for what felt like the 100th time. Muscle memory saved my life more than once overseas. Might save yours too someday. Emily absorbed everything with fierce determination, refusing to be the fragile victim. Daniel had spent 5 years convincing her she was refusing to let Viktor Sokolov's organization believe threatening a single note left on her truck would be enough to break her resolve. 10 days after the break-in, while Emily was closing up the bar alongside Jackson, her phone buzzed with an unknown number for the second time in 2 weeks. Her hands went cold with immediate recognition of the pattern. She answered on speaker so Jackson could hear. "Emily Carter," a voice said, male, calm, entirely unfamiliar. "You've been busy lately. Federal agents, motorcycle club protection, very resourceful for someone who's supposed to be terrified into silence." "Who is this?" Emily demanded, though some instinctive part of her already suspected the answer. "Let's just say I represent interests that would prefer certain information remain buried," the voice said smoothly. "Consider this your final courtesy warning. Whatever you think you know, whatever fragments of memory you're offering federal investigators, it's not worth what will happen to you or the people you've surrounded yourself with if you continue cooperating." Jackson's expression had gone hard as stone, his hand already reaching for his own phone to trace the call. "You don't scare me anymore," Emily said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear pounding through her veins. "I've already survived worse than vague phone threats." "Have you?" the voice asked, something almost amused in his tone. "Tell me, Emily, did you enjoy your victory in court last week? Because I have to admit, watching Daniel cross his face when that judge referred his case for investigation was quite satisfying for us as well. He'd become significantly more liability than asset by that point." Emily's blood ran cold. "You're admitting you had something to do with his disappearance." "I'm admitting nothing," the voice said. "Omanan, I'm simply pointing out that people who become inconvenient to certain interests tend to find themselves facing very serious consequences. Daniel learned that lesson. I'd hate for you to require the same education." The line went dead before Emily could respond, leaving her staring at her phone with hands that had begun shaking uncontrollably. Jackson was already dialing Agent Chen's number, his expression a mixture of fury and fierce protectiveness that Emily had never seen quite so intensely before. "They're threatening her directly now," Jackson said into the phone, barely containing the anger in his voice. "Practically confessed to Daniel's disappearance. We need that call traced immediately." While Jackson spoke with federal agents, Emily sat frozen at the bar, processing the horrifying confirmation that Daniel Cross, despite everything cruel and manipulative he'd done to her, had likely paid the ultimate price for becoming inconvenient to considerably more dangerous people. And now that same danger had turned its full attention directly toward her. Raymond arrived within minutes of Jackson's call, his expression grave as he listened to Emily recount the conversation word for word. "They're getting desperate," Raymond said finally. "Confessing that much, even indirectly, means they're worried about what you already know or what you might eventually remember." "I don't know anything else," Emily insisted. "Just fragments, a name, a description, some overheard conversation about evidence being handled." "Sometimes fragments are exactly what breaks a case wide open," Raymond said. "Which means you've become more valuable to this investigation than you realize, and considerably more dangerous to Sokolov's organization than a simple bystander." Agent Chen arrived at the bar within the hour, her expression tense as she reviewed the phone records Jackson had already begun gathering. "The call came from a burner phone," she confirmed, after making several calls of her own. "Untraceable through normal means, though our tech team might be able to extract something useful with more time." "Time we might not have," Jackson said grimly. "I need to reconsider the safe house option," Agent Chen said, turning to Emily. "This threat was significantly more direct than anything we've seen so far. If they're willing to essentially confess involvement in Daniel Cross's disappearance, even obliquely, that suggests a level of confidence or desperation that makes your continued exposure here considerably more dangerous." Emily felt the walls closing in around her, the fragile safety she'd built over the past 2 months threatening to collapse under the weight of a danger far bigger than anything she'd ever imagined facing. She looked around the room at Raymond, at Jackson, at the club members who had rallied around her without hesitation, despite barely knowing her 2 months earlier. "Give me tonight to think," Emily said quietly. "Please, I need to figure out what the right choice actually is here, not just the safest one." Agent Chen nodded reluctantly. 24 hours, Ms. Carter. After that, if you haven't made a decision, I'll need to strongly recommend protective custody regardless of your personal preference given the severity of this threat. After the agent left, Emily retreated upstairs to the small room that had become her temporary home, her mind racing through impossible choices. Leave everything behind, disappear into federal protection, abandon the only real family she'd found in years. Or stay, fight, risk everything, including her life, for the chance to help bring down a criminal organization responsible for God knew how many other destroyed lives. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Jackson stood in the doorway, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Can I come in?" he asked. Emily nodded and Jackson sat carefully on the edge of the small bed, close enough that Emily could feel warmth radiating from him, despite the tension still coursing through both their bodies. "Whatever you decide," Jackson said quietly, "I need you to know something first." "What's that?" "These past 2 months," Jackson said, his voice rougher than usual, "you've changed something in this club. In me specifically, if I'm being honest. I spent years convinced I'd never trust anyone again after my divorce, never let myself care about someone enough, that losing them would actually hurt." Emily's breath caught, understanding immediately where this conversation was heading, part of her terrified and part of her desperately hoping. "And now," she asked softly, "now the idea of you disappearing into some federal safe house, maybe never seeing you again, maybe spending the rest of my life wondering if you're safe somewhere I can't protect you." Jackson said, his dark eyes intense and unguarded in a way Emily had never seen before. "That terrifies me more than any threat Sokolov's people could possibly make." "Jackson, I'm not trying to influence your decision," Jackson said quickly. "This has to be about your safety, not about what I want. I just needed you to know whatever happens next that you matter. Not just to this club as some cause worth protecting. To me specifically as a person I've come to care about more than I expected to care about anyone again." Emily reached out, taking his hand in hers, feeling the roughness of his calloused fingers, the slight tremor betraying emotions he rarely allowed himself to show. "I don't want to disappear either," she whispered. "Not from this club, and not from you." Jackson's fingers tightened around hers, something fierce and protective and unmistakably tender passing between them in the charged silence of that small room. "Then we fight," he said firmly, "together, whatever that takes." Emily nodded, feeling something solidify inside her chest, a resolve stronger than any fear Viktor Sokolov's organization could manufacture. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't disappearing, wasn't hiding, wasn't letting dangerous men dictate the terms of her existence the way Daniel had for 5 agonizing years. Tomorrow she would tell Agent Chen her decision. She was staying. She was fighting. And whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. But as Jackson finally left her room that night, as Emily lay awake staring at the ceiling, with his warmth still lingering against her palm, she couldn't shake the growing certainty that the true danger, the real confrontation with whoever had made Daniel Cross disappear, hadn't even begun yet. Somewhere out there in the darkness beyond the desert town's edges, Viktor Sokolov's organization was already calculating their next move. And Emily suspected with a cold certainty that settled deep in her bones that their next move would be far more devastating than a broken window or a threatening phone call. Morning brought Agent Chen back to the bar exactly on schedule, and Emily met her at the door with a steadiness in her spine that hadn't been there 24 hours earlier. "I'm staying," Emily said before the agent could even ask. "I'm not going into protective custody." Agent Chen studied her for a long moment. "You understand what that means. You understand the level of risk you're accepting." "I understand it better than you think," Emily said. "I spent 5 years accepting risk just to survive a relationship. I'm not about to run from the first real family I've found because dangerous men made a phone call." Agent Chen's expression shifted, something that looked almost like respect breaking through her professional caution. "All right," she said, "then we do this smart. I'm assigning a second team to monitor the area. Any unusual activity, any vehicle you don't recognize sitting too long in that parking lot, you call me directly. Not the sheriff's office, not 911, me." "Understood," Raymond said, stepping in beside Emily. "There's something else," Agent Chen added, pulling a folder from her bag. "We got a partial hit on the burner phone. Can't trace the exact location, but the carrier pinged a tower about 40 miles from here 2 nights ago. That puts whoever made that call within driving distance of this bar." The room went quiet. 40 miles isn't exactly a tight radius," Jackson said. "No," Agent Chen agreed. "But it tells us they're local, or at least local enough to keep eyes on Emily without much trouble. which means whatever security you have already put in place, I'd double it. Over the following week, life at the Vulture's Roost settled into a strange new rhythm. One part normal bar operation, one part armed vigilance. Emily still poured drinks, still memorized orders, still laughed at Tiny's terrible jokes, but underneath all of it ran a current of tension that never fully switched off. Every unfamiliar car that pulled into the lot got noted. Every stranger who walked through the door got a quiet, careful once-over from whichever member happened to be closest to the entrance. Doc, despite Raymond's gentle protests about his health, insisted on taking the morning shifts watching the security monitors Jackson had installed, his trembling hands surprisingly steady on the keyboard as he flagged anything that looked out of place. Man my age doesn't get many chances to feel useful anymore. Doc told Emily one morning when she tried once again to convince him to rest. Let me have this. Emily didn't argue after that. It was on the 9th day that everything changed. Emily was in the storage room counting inventory when she heard raised voices from the front of the bar. Not the usual boisterous chatter of regulars, but something sharper, more urgent. She stepped out just in time to see Jackson and 2 other members surrounding a man near the entrance, a stranger in a rumpled jacket who held both hands up defensively. I'm not here for trouble, the man was saying, his voice shaking slightly. I swear to God, I just need 5 minutes. Please. Who are you? Raymond demanded, stepping between the man and the rest of the room, his massive frame a wall of quiet menace. My name's Peter Nguyen, the man said. I worked for Daniel Cross, financial analyst, before I quit 6 months ago. His eyes darted toward Emily, recognition flickering across his face. You're Emily, Daniel's ex. Emily's stomach twisted. How do you know who I am? Because Daniel used to talk about you, Peter said. Complained about you mostly. But that's not why I'm here. He swallowed hard, glancing nervously toward the door, as though he expected someone to burst through it any second. I quit because I found things in the company's books I wasn't supposed to find. Things connecting cross-capital to accounts I later learned were tied to Viktor Sokolov's operation. The room went utterly silent. Why are you telling us this now? Jackson asked, his voice low and dangerous. Because I've been running for 6 months, Peter said, his voice cracking. Since I quit it, I've had people following me. My apartment got broken into twice. I lost my new job because somebody made anonymous calls to my employer. And then I heard through a mutual contact that Daniel disappeared, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for me too, to make sure I never talk. So why come here? Raymond asked. Why not go straight to the FBI? Because I don't trust which agents might already be compromised. Peter said, fear evident in every word. Sokolov's organization has been buying influence for years. I heard Emily was already cooperating with a specific agent, someone outside the local field office. I figured if anyone could get information to the right hands without it leaking back to the wrong ones, it would be someone already this deep in the fight. Emily felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. 2 months ago, she'd been a stranger walking through this door desperate for a paycheck. Now apparently she'd become someone frightened men sought out as their last hope of safety. What do you know? Emily asked quietly. Peter reached into his jacket, and every single person in the room tensed hands, moving instinctively toward weapons or defensive positions. But he only pulled out a flash drive, holding it out with trembling fingers. Everything, he said. Bank transfers, shell company records, communications between Daniel and Sokolov's people going back 3 years. I copied it all before I quit, kept it hidden, because some part of me always knew I'd need it eventually. Raymond took the drive, carefully turning it over in his palm like it was something explosive. This could be exactly what breaks this case wide open, Jackson said. It could also get us all killed, Raymond countered, his voice grave. If Sokolov's people knew Peter came here, knew he handed this over, they already suspect, Peter interrupted. I've been careful, but nobody stays hidden from these people forever. I came here because I'm out of options and because I figured if anyone in this town had the resources and the courage to actually protect this information, it would be you. Emily called Agent Chen immediately, her hands steady despite the enormity of what was unfolding. Within 2 hours, the agent arrived alongside a small team, and Peter Nguyen was whisked into an interview room set up hastily in the back office, his testimony recorded alongside the contents of the flash drive. This is substantial. Agent Chen told Emily and Raymond afterward, her professional composure cracking just slightly with visible excitement. If everything on this drive checks out, We're looking at enough evidence to indict Sokolov's entire operation. Money laundering, wire fraud, obstruction, this could be the case that finally brings the whole organization down. And Daniel, Emily asked, any evidence about what actually happened to him? Agent Chen's expression sobered. There are references in some of these communications to handling loose ends. Given the timing, it's not looking good for Mr. Cross's survival, though we haven't recovered a body. Despite everything Daniel had done to her, despite 5 years of cruelty and manipulation, Emily felt an unexpected pang of something that wasn't quite grief, but wasn't nothing either. He had been a terrible person, but he hadn't deserved whatever fate Sokolov's people had decided for him once he became inconvenient. This changes things considerably, Agent Chen continued. With this evidence, we can move faster than originally planned, but it also means Sokolov's organization knows their exposure just increased dramatically. They're going to be more desperate, more dangerous in the days ahead. Meaning, Raymond asked. Meaning I need everyone in this bar on maximum alert, Agent Chen said. Because cornered animals don't retreat quietly, they lash out. That warning proved prophetic faster than anyone anticipated. 2 nights later, around midnight, Doc was manning the security monitors when he suddenly went rigid in his chair. Raymond, he called out, his voice tight with alarm. You need to see this. Raymond crossed the room in 3 long strides, Jackson right behind him, and Emily followed despite Jackson's instinctive gesture for her to stay back. On the screen, grainy footage showed 2 vehicles parked at the edge of the lot, engines off, headlights dark. 4 figures emerged, moving with the deliberate, coordinated precision of men who had done this kind of work before. That's not local trouble, Jackson said grimly. That's a professional team. They're not even trying to hide from the cameras, Doc observed, his voice shaking slightly, which means either they don't know we're watching or they don't care. Get everyone up, Raymond ordered, already moving toward the gun safe hidden behind the bar. Now. Within minutes, the bar transformed into something out of a war film club, members positioning themselves at windows and entry points with a practiced efficiency that told Emily this wasn't the first time some of these men had prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation. Emily's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, adrenaline and fear tangling together into something almost paralyzing. Emily, Jackson said, gripping her shoulders firmly, forcing her attention onto him. I need you in the back, office door locked, and I need you to call Agent Chen right now and tell her exactly what's happening. Can you do that? Emily nodded, though her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped her phone. Hey, Jackson said, his voice softening just slightly, despite the danger radiating through every line of his body. You survived, Daniel. You survived a courtroom built to destroy you. You are not going to fall apart now when it matters most. I need you steady. Can you be steady for me? Something about the way he said it, the raw honesty underneath the urgency, settled Emily's racing heart just enough to steady her hands. I can be steady, she said firmly. Jackson nodded once, pressed a quick, hard kiss to her forehead, and then he was gone, moving toward the front of the bar, with the rest of the men, leaving Emily alone in the back office with nothing but a locked door and a phone call to Agent Chen standing between her and whatever was about to unfold outside. They're here, Emily said into the phone the moment Agent Chen picked up. 4 men, 2 vehicles moving like they know what they're doing. Raymond thinks it's Sokolov's people. Stay exactly where you are, Agent Chen said immediately, her voice sharp with focus. I'm dispatching backup now, but it's going to take at least 15 minutes to get units there. Do you understand me? 15 minutes. 15 minutes felt like an eternity. Emily crouched beneath the desk in the back office, phone pressed against her ear, listening to Agent Chen's voice while straining to hear anything happening beyond the locked door. For several agonizing minutes, there was nothing but silence, the kind of thick, suffocating silence that felt far more terrifying than any noise could have been. Then the silence broke. A crash. Shouting. The unmistakable, heart-stopping sound of gunfire cracking through the night. Emily's entire body went cold, every instinct screaming at her to run toward the sound, toward Jackson, toward Raymond, toward the people who had become her family in the span of 2 short months. But she forced herself to stay exactly where Jackson had told her, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. What's happening? Agent Chen demanded, having heard the gunfire through the call. I don't know, Emily said, tears streaming down her face despite her attempts to stay composed. I can't see anything. I just heard shots. More shouting, more chaos, and then terrifyingly, silence again, a silence that stretched on so long, Emily thought her heart might actually stop from the strain of waiting. Finally, footsteps approached the office door, heavy and uneven, and Emily's breath caught in her throat as the handle jiggled. "Emily, it's me. Open up!" Jackson's voice. Emily scrambled to unlock the door, throwing it open to find Jackson standing there, blood on his sleeve, but his own eyes wide and alert, clearly not his injury. "Are you hurt?" she gasped, immediately reaching for him. "It's not mine," Jackson said quickly, though his voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "It's Raymond's. He's hit. We need to get him help right now." Emily's world tilted violently. She followed Jackson out into the main bar, and the scene that greeted her would stay burned into her memory for the rest of her life. Raymond sitting propped against the bar, Tiny pressing a bundled cloth hard against his shoulder, blood soaking through despite the pressure. His face pale, but his expression somehow still stubbornly calm. "I'm fine," Raymond said, though his voice was strained. "Bullet went through, didn't hit anything vital. Doc already checked." "You're not fine, you're bleeding everywhere," Emily said, panic rising sharp in her throat. "I've had worse," Raymond said, attempting a reassuring smile that came out more like a grimace. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, and within minutes, the parking lot filled with flashing lights, federal agents and local police swarming the property. Emily learned quickly in fragmented pieces relayed by shaken club members exactly what had happened during those terrifying 15 minutes. The four men who'd approached the bar hadn't been simply casing the property. They'd come armed, prepared for exactly the kind of confrontation that followed, clearly intending to eliminate whatever threat Emily and the flash drive's information posed to Sokolov's operation. But Raymond and Jackson's men, already braced and ready, had met that threat with a coordinated defense that ultimately drove the attackers back, though not before Raymond took a bullet meant for someone else entirely. He stepped in front of Tiny. The doc told Emily quietly while paramedics loaded Raymond into an ambulance, despite his continued protest that he was fine. Saw one of them aiming right at Tiny's back, and he just moved. Didn't even hesitate. Emily watched the ambulance doors close, watched Raymond's face disappear behind them, and felt something crack open inside her chest. A raw, overwhelming gratitude tangled up with fear and guilt, so heavy it nearly buckled her knees. "This is my fault," she whispered. Jackson, standing beside her, immediately shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "This is Sokolov's fault. This is Daniel's fault for whatever he did that put all of us in this position. You didn't ask for any of this, Emily. You didn't choose to overhear a name years ago that turned out to matter this much. But if you hadn't come here, Jackson interrupted, his voice hardening with conviction. "Peter Nguyen never finds someone brave enough to hand over that flash drive. Sokolov's organization keeps operating exactly like it has for years, destroying more lives, laundering more money, ruining more people who never get justice. You didn't cause this violence, Emily. You're the reason it might actually end." Emily wanted desperately to believe him, but guilt sat heavy and sour in her stomach as she watched the ambulance pull away. Sirens cutting through the desert night. 2 men had been captured during the confrontation, wounded but alive, immediately taken into federal custody. The other 2 had escaped into the darkness, their vehicles found abandoned 3 miles away the following morning, completely empty. Raymond survived surgery without complication, though the doctors insisted he remain hospitalized for at least 3 days for observation. Emily visited him the following afternoon, finding him propped up in a hospital bed, looking irritated more than injured, already arguing with a nurse about being discharged early. "You saved Tiny's life," Emily said quietly, settling into the chair beside his bed once the nurse had given up and left the room. "That's what family does," Raymond said simply, as though it required no further explanation. "I keep thinking about what you said that first day I walked into the bar," Emily continued, "about protecting your own. I didn't understand then what that actually meant. I do now." Raymond studied her for a long moment, his weathered face softening. "You've become part of this family faster than almost anyone I've ever seen," he said. "Not because we felt sorry for you, because you proved over and over that you deserve to belong here." Emily felt tears threatening again, an entirely different kind of emotion than the fear and grief of the past several days. "Agent Chen came by this morning," Raymond continued. "Told me the 2 men in custody are already talking, trying to cut deals in exchange for reduced sentences. Between their testimony and everything on Peter's flash drive, she thinks they've got enough to move forward with major indictments within the next few weeks." Including whoever's actually responsible for Daniel, Emily asked. Including that, Raymond confirmed. Turns out one of the men they captured was directly involved in that particular loose end. Confirmed everything the FBI suspected. Daniel Cross's dead has been since the night he disappeared. Sokolov ordered it personally, worried Daniel would try cutting his own deal with prosecutors to save himself. Despite everything Daniel had done, despite years of cruelty that still occasionally haunted Emily's quietest moments, she felt a complicated wave of grief pass through her morning. Not the man he'd become, but perhaps the possibility of who he might have been before greed and control consumed him entirely. I'm sorry, Raymond said gently, noticing her expression. I know that's complicated to hear. It is, Emily admitted, but it's also closure in a strange way. I spent months wondering if he'd suddenly reappear, if this was all some elaborate manipulation designed to make me feel safe again before he struck. Now at least I know the truth. Raymond reached out, squeezing her hand with surprising gentleness for a man his size. The truth's always better than living in fear of what you don't know, he said, even when the truth hurts. Emily nodded, understanding that lesson now on a level she hadn't fully grasped, even during her worst moments with Daniel. 3 days later, Raymond returned to the bar against his doctor's explicit recommendations, waving off concerns with the same stubborn determination that seemed to define everything about him. The entire club welcomed him back with a celebration that rivaled the one following Emily's courtroom victory, Tiny insisting loudly and repeatedly that Raymond's recovery deserved nothing less than the good whiskey Doc had been saving. Amid the celebration, Emily found herself standing near the jukebox with Jackson watching Raymond hold court with the rest of the members, his laugh booming across the room, despite the sling still supporting his injured arm. He really would have died for any one of us, Emily said quietly. I didn't fully understand that kind of loyalty existed until I watched it happen in front of me. That's the whole foundation this club is built on, Jackson said. Everything else, the reputation, the intimidation, the stories people whisper about us in town, none of that matters as much as what you just described. We protect each other. Full stop, no exceptions. I want to be part of that fully, Emily said, turning to look at him directly. Not just as an employee anymore. Not just as someone you're protecting because Raymond made a decision 2 months ago. I want to actually belong here the way Doc belongs, the way Tiny belongs. Jackson's expression shifted to something warm and unguarded, breaking through his usual careful composure. You already do belong, he said. Have for weeks now, whether you fully recognized it or not. Emily felt her heart swell with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel fully in years. Genuine belonging, genuine safety, genuine hope for a future that didn't involve constantly looking over her shoulder. There's something else, Jackson said, his voice growing slightly more serious. Something I have been wanting to say since that night before the attack, but everything happened so fast afterward, there wasn't time. What is it? Jackson took a breath, and for a moment the fierce guarded enforcer Emily had first met 2 months earlier looked almost nervous, an expression that seemed foreign on his hardened features. I know the timing is complicated, he said. You just went through hell with Daniel with the investigation, with everything Sokolov's people put you through. I don't want you to feel pressured or rushed into anything, but I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't just about protecting someone the club decided to take under its wing. It's about you specifically, your strength, your kindness, even after everything that tried to break it. The way you make this place feel more like a home than it's felt in years. Emily's breath caught, her heart pounding for entirely different reasons than fear now. Jackson, she started, but he continued before she could finish. I'm not asking for anything right now, he said quickly. I just needed you to know whatever comes next in your life, whatever you decide to do once all of this settles down, the investigation, the trials, whatever comes after, I want to be part of your future. Not because you need protecting, because I care about you more than I've cared about anyone since my divorce, and I'm done pretending that's not true. Emily reached up, cupping his face gently in her palm, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingers, watching surprise and hope flicker across his normally guarded expression. I care about you too, she said softly. More than I probably should, given everything that's happened. But I'm tired of being scared of my own feelings just because the timing seems complicated. Life's too short and too unpredictable to keep waiting for some perfect moment that might never come. The space between them closed slowly, deliberately, until their lips met in a kiss that felt like the culmination of 2 months of careful trust building, Shared danger and quiet understanding neither of them had expected to find in a desert biker bar that most of the town still considered too dangerous to enter. When they finally broke apart, Jackson rested his forehead against hers, a genuine smile, rare and beautiful, spreading across his usually serious face. "Raymond's going to give me endless hell about this," he murmured. "I think Raymond already knew before either of us figured it out," Emily said, laughing softly despite everything. As if summoned by the conversation itself, Raymond's voice boomed from across the room. "Finally!" he shouted, raising his glass in their direction, the entire club erupting into laughter and good-natured teasing. "Took you two long enough." Emily buried her burning face against Jackson's shoulder, laughing, despite herself feeling something settle deep in her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Happiness, real uncomplicated happiness, built on a foundation of trust and loyalty she never could have imagined finding in the place everyone in town had once warned her to avoid at all costs. But even as the celebration continued around her, even as Jackson's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, Emily knew this peace was temporary. Somewhere out there, Viktor Sokolov remained free, his organization wounded but not yet destroyed, and the men who had escaped into the desert darkness 3 nights earlier were still out there too, presumably reporting back to their employer about the failed attack. The federal case was building momentum. Indictments reportedly imminent, but powerful men rarely surrendered without one final desperate act of retaliation. Emily allowed herself this moment of joy, this fragile peace, surrounded by people who had become her family in every way that mattered. But deep down, she understood with absolute certainty that the true final confrontation with Viktor Sokolov's organization hadn't happened yet. And whatever form that confrontation eventually took, it would test everything she had rebuilt over these past 2 months, her strength, her family, and the fragile new happiness she had only just begun allowing herself to fully embrace. The indictments came down 11 days later, and Agent Chen delivered the news personally, walking into the bar with a folder thick enough that Tiny let out a low whistle just looking at it. "Viktor Sokolov," she said, setting the folder on the counter, "along with 14 associates charged this morning with racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and a dozen other counts that are going to keep federal prosecutors busy for the next 2 years. The room erupted into cheers, but Agent Chen held up a hand, her expression still carefully measured. "Before everyone celebrates too hard," she said, "I need to tell you something else. Sokolov wasn't home when agents executed the arrest warrant this morning." Emily's stomach dropped instantly, the celebration around her fading into background noise. "He's gone." "We believe he was tipped off," Agent Chen said grimly, "possibly hours before the raid, which means he's had time to prepare, time to disappear, and potentially time to settle whatever scores he feels are still outstanding before he runs." "Meaning me," Emily said quietly. "Meaning you," Chen confirmed. "You're the reason Peter Nguyen found the courage to come forward. You're a key witness in this case. If Sokolov's calculating his exit strategy, eliminating loose ends before he vanishes for good, would be exactly the kind of move a man like him makes." Jackson's arm tightened protectively around Emily's shoulders, his jaw set with the same fierce determination Emily had come to recognize whenever danger circled too close. "Then we don't let him get anywhere near her," Jackson said. "That's exactly why I'm here," Agent Chen said. "We're increasing protective surveillance immediately. But I won't lie to you, a man like Sokolov, with the resources he's built over the years, finding creative ways around surveillance isn't out of the question." Raymond, still favoring his injured shoulder, slightly stepped forward with the same steady authority that had anchored this entire ordeal from its earliest, most terrifying moments. "Then we don't wait for him to make the first move," he said. "We anticipate it. We prepare for it. And when he shows up, because men like Sokolov always eventually show up when they feel cornered, we make sure he walks straight into exactly the kind of trap he never sees coming." Agent Chen studied Raymond for a long moment, clearly weighing the wisdom of encouraging a plan that fell so far outside standard federal protocol. "I can't officially endorse civilians setting traps for a fugitive," she said carefully. "But I also can't officially ignore the fact that your security setup here has already proven more effective than anything the Bureau could mobilize on short notice." She paused, something like reluctant respect crossing her features. "Unofficially, keep doing what you're doing. Just make sure my team knows the moment anything unusual happens." Over the following week, the atmosphere at the Vulture's Roost stretched taut with anticipation. Every member moving through their days with a particular alertness, of soldiers waiting for a battle they knew was coming, but couldn't predict the timing of. Emily found herself grateful in a strange way for the structure, Doc's self-defense lessons, and Jackson's constant vigilance provided something to focus on besides the crushing uncertainty of not knowing when or how Sokolov might finally make his move. It was Doc who noticed the first signs 7 days after the indictments, sitting hunched over the security monitors during his usual morning shift. "Raymond," he called out, his voice tighter than Emily had ever heard it. Same car circled the block 3 times in the last 20 minutes. Raymond crossed the room, immediately studying the grainy footage with narrowed eyes. A dark sedan tinted windows moving slowly past the bar's entrance before disappearing down the street only to reappear several minutes later from a different direction. "Could be nothing," Jackson said, though his tense posture suggested he didn't believe that any more than Raymond did. "Could be," Raymond agreed, "or it could be somebody scouting the property before deciding how to approach." Agent Chen arrived within the hour, reviewing the footage herself with grim focus. "License plates registered to a rental company out of Phoenix," she said after running the numbers. "Rented 3 days ago under a name that's almost certainly fake given how quickly it comes back with no other records attached." "So he's here," Emily said quietly, the reality of it settling cold and heavy in her chest. "Sokolov's actually here watching this place, trying to figure out how to get to me." "Or someone working for him," Agent Chen said. "Sokolov himself is smart enough to keep his own hands clean until the very last possible moment." That night, Emily couldn't sleep, lying awake in the small room above the bar, listening to the quiet murmur of club members maintaining watch downstairs, the periodic crunch of gravel as someone did a perimeter check around the parking lot. Around 2 in the morning, a soft knock sounded at her door, and Jackson slipped inside, his expression tired but alert. "Can't sleep either?" Emily asked, echoing the same question he had once asked her weeks earlier. "Not with him out there somewhere," Jackson admitted, sitting beside her on the edge of the bed. "Not knowing exactly when he's going to try something makes it worse than actually facing him would." "I keep thinking about what Agent Chen said," Emily admitted, "about him eliminating loose ends. I keep wondering if this whole thing only ends when one of us doesn't walk away from whatever happens next." Jackson took her hand, his grip firm and grounding. "That's not how this ends," he said with a certainty that Emily desperately wanted to believe. "You've survived, Daniel. You've survived a courtroom battle designed to destroy your credibility. You've survived an armed attack on this bar. Sokolov is not going to be the thing that finally breaks you, Emily. Not while I'm breathing." "You can't promise that," Emily said softly. "No," Jackson agreed, "but I can promise I'll do everything in my power to make it true." 3 days later, the waiting finally ended. Emily was behind the bar during the slow afternoon lull, restocking glasses, when the front door swung open and a man stepped inside wearing a delivery uniform carrying a large box marked with a shipping company's logo. "Got a delivery for Raymond Walker," the man said, his voice pleasant, unremarkable, the kind of voice that belonged to 100 different delivery drivers Emily had encountered over her lifetime. Something about him made her hesitate, though she couldn't immediately articulate why. "I'll sign for it," she offered, stepping around the bar. The man's eyes flicked toward her just for a fraction of a second, something calculating, passing behind an otherwise unremarkable expression. Emily's instincts, awed, sharpened by months of careful vigilance, screamed at her that something was wrong. "Actually," the man said, setting the box down on the nearest table rather than handing it to her directly, "I need Mr. Walker specifically to sign company policy for high-value shipments." Jackson had already noticed the exchange from across the room, moving casually but purposefully toward the front of the bar, his expression unreadable, but his body coiled with readiness. "I'll get him," Emily said, buying time, backing away from the box with a growing sense of dread she couldn't fully explain. The moment she turned, everything happened at once. The delivery man's hand moved toward his jacket with a speed that shattered any illusion of an ordinary package drop-off, but Jackson was faster, closing the distance in 2 long strides and slamming into him before he could fully draw whatever weapon he'd been reaching for. The 2 men crashed into a table, sending glasses shattering across the floor, and within seconds, 3 other club members converged on the struggle, wrestling the man to the ground despite his violent, desperate resistance. "Gun!" Jackson shouted, wrenching a pistol from the man's jacket and tossing it well out of reach. Emily stood frozen near the bar, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might actually break through her ribs, watching as the man was finally subdued, pinned face down against the floor, while Raymond, alerted by the commotion, burst out from his office with fury etched across every line of his face. Who sent you? Raymond demanded, kneeling beside the restrained man. The man said nothing, his jaw clenched tight, defiant even now. Check the box, Jackson said grimly, still breathing hard from the struggle. Doc, ever careful, approached the package with visible trepidation, examining it from every angle before carefully cutting the tape and folding back the cardboard flaps. Inside, nestled among packing material, sat a device that made Doc's face drain of all color. That's not a delivery, Doc said, his voice shaking. That's a bomb. The room went utterly deathly silent. Everybody out, Raymond ordered immediately, his voice cutting through the shock like a blade. Now, Emily, go, go, go. Chaos erupted as club members scrambled toward the exits, ushering confused afternoon customers out ahead of them while Jackson grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her toward the back entrance, putting as much distance between themselves and the device as physically possible. Within minutes, everyone had cleared the building, standing in a tense cluster across the street, while Agent Chen's team, alerted immediately, rushed toward the scene alongside a bomb disposal unit that arrived with terrifying speed. Emily watched from behind a police barricade, Jackson's arm wrapped tightly around her. Both of them trembling with adrenaline and the horrifying weight of how close disaster had come to consuming everything they'd built. If you hadn't hesitated, Jackson said quietly, his voice raw, if you'd taken that box directly from him like he wanted— I know, Emily whispered, unable to fully process how narrowly she'd avoided catastrophe. The bomb disposal unit worked for nearly 2 hours before finally confirming the device had been successfully neutralized, though the delay felt like an eternity, stretched across the longest afternoon of Emily's life. The captured man, identified through fingerprints as a known associate of Sokolov's organization, refused to speak initially, invoking his right to silence with practiced ease. But Agent Chen's expression, when she finally approached Emily and Jackson afterward, carried a grim satisfaction that suggested the investigation had gained significant new ground regardless. We have him on attempted murder now, in addition to whatever conspiracy charges apply, she said, and we recovered his phone before he could destroy it. Preliminary data extraction already shows communications directly linking him to Sokolov within the last 48 hours. So you can find Sokolov now? Emily asked, desperate hope cutting through her lingering shock. We're working on it, Agent Chen said. The phone data gives us a general area somewhere within a 100-mile radius, but Sokolov's smart enough to keep moving to avoid patterns that make him easy to track precisely. That evening, after the bomb squad finally cleared the building and allowed everyone back inside, the entire club gathered in the main room. The shattered glass swept away, but the memory of how close they'd come to losing everything still hanging heavy in the air. This has to end, Raymond said, addressing the group with an intensity Emily hadn't seen from him before, not even during the worst moments of the previous weeks. Sokolov's not going to stop sending people until either he's caught or somebody in this building doesn't survive the next attempt. What are you suggesting? Jackson asked. I'm suggesting we stop waiting for him to come to us, Raymond said. I'm suggesting we help the FBI find him faster than he expects before he gets the chance to try something even worse than a bomb in a delivery box. How? Emily asked. We don't have federal resources. We don't have surveillance capabilities like Agent Chen's team. No, Raymond agreed, but we've got something they don't. What's that? Connections, Raymond said. This club's been around for decades, Emily. We've got relationships with other chapters across 3 states. Brothers who know this desert better than any federal agent ever could. People who notice things law enforcement might miss entirely because they're not looking in the right places. Agent Chen, who had remained in the bar coordinating with her team, overheard this exchange and stepped forward, her expression conflicted. I can't officially sanction civilian involvement in an active federal manhunt, she said carefully. But if information happens to come to my attention through unofficial channels, I'm certainly not going to refuse to act on it. Raymond nodded, understanding exactly what she was permitting without directly authorizing. Over the following 2 days, word spread quietly through motorcycle club networks across the region, descriptions and information about Sokolov circulating through channels invisible to conventional law enforcement. Emily watched with growing amazement as Raymond's phone rang constantly. Brothers from chapters she'd never heard of calling in tips sightings. Unusual activity reported at remote properties that federal databases had somehow overlooked. It was Tiny, of all people, who received the call that finally broke the case wide open. My cousin runs a bar out near the state line, Tiny explained excitedly, gathering everyone around the counter. Says a man matching Sokolov's description has been renting a cabin about 15 miles out, paying cash, keeping to himself, but ordering supplies delivered instead of going into town himself. Agent Chen was already on her phone before Tiny finished speaking, relaying the information to her team with barely contained urgency. Within hours, federal agents had the cabin under careful, discreet surveillance, confirming through long-range observation that the man matched Sokolov's physical description precisely. "We're moving on it tonight," Agent Chen told Raymond and Jackson, her voice tight with focused anticipation. "Full tactical team coordinated approach. This ends tonight one way or another." Emily felt a complicated tangle of emotions as she watched federal vehicles assemble outside the bar before departing toward the state line under cover of darkness. Relief that this nightmare might finally reach its conclusion, but also a lingering gnawing fear that something could still go catastrophically wrong. She spent that night exactly the way she'd spent so many others over the past months, sitting at the bar with Jackson beside her, both of them silent, both of them waiting for news that felt like it would never come. Around midnight, Agent Chen's call finally broke the unbearable silence. "We got him," she said, and even through the phone, Emily could hear the exhaustion and relief mixed together in her voice. "Sokolov's in custody. No casualties on our end. He tried to run when agents breached the cabin, but he didn't get far." Emily nearly collapsed with relief, and Jackson caught her instinctively holding her steady as the weight of months of fear finally began lifting from her shoulders. "It's over," Emily whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "It's actually over." "It's over," Jackson confirmed, pressing a gentle kiss against her temple. The bar erupted into celebration once the news spread, an entire club releasing months of accumulated tension in a single overwhelming wave of relief and joy. Tiny hoisted Emily off her feet in an enormous bear hug that made her laugh despite the tears streaming down her face. Doc poured drinks for everyone, insisting this called for the very best bottle he'd been saving, declaring the occasion worthy of nothing less. Raymond simply stood back for a moment, watching the celebration with an expression of quiet, profound satisfaction before Emily crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him in a fierce, grateful hug. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder, "for everything, for giving me a chance nobody else would, for protecting me even when it meant risking your own life, for teaching me what family actually means." Raymond returned the embrace carefully, mindful of his healing shoulder, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "You earned every bit of it," he said. "Don't ever forget that. This wasn't charity, Emily. This was recognizing something special in you from the very first day you walked through that door." The weeks that followed brought a flurry of legal proceedings, Sokolov's arrest triggering a cascade of arrests and indictments throughout his sprawling criminal network. Emily testified before a grand jury, her voice steady despite the enormity of the courtroom and the weight of everything riding on her testimony, describing everything she remembered from those overheard conversations years earlier, with a clarity that prosecutors later told her had been instrumental in securing the strongest possible charges. Peter Nguyen, whose courage in bringing forward that flash drive had started this entire chain of events, received witness protection and a new life far from the shadow of Cross Capital Holdings, though he reached out to Emily once more before disappearing into his new identity simply to thank her for believing him when he'd shown up terrified at her doorstep. Daniel Cross's body was eventually recovered from a remote location in the desert, allowing his estranged family people Emily had never even known existed during their 5 years together to finally receive closure regarding his fate. Emily attended his small, quiet funeral standing at the back, feeling a complicated mixture of grief and closure that she suspected would take considerable time to fully process. Whatever cruelty Daniel had shown her, whatever damage he'd inflicted during their relationship, he hadn't deserved the violent end Sokolov's organization had ultimately dealt him. "You didn't have to come," Jackson said quietly, standing beside her at the small memorial service. "I know," Emily said, "but some part of me needed to say goodbye properly. Not to the man who hurt me, to the possibility of who he could have been before he chose the path that led him here." Jackson squeezed her hand, gently understanding without needing further explanation. 6 months after that terrifying afternoon with the delivery box life at the Vulture's Roost had settled into something remarkably close to normal, though normal now carried a richness and depth Emily could never have imagined finding in her life before walking through those doors as a desperate stranger. Raymond had officially promoted her to managing the bar's daily operations, trusting her with responsibilities that extended far beyond simply pouring drinks and remembering orders. She'd redesigned the entire inventory system, negotiated better rates with suppliers, even convinced Raymond to expand the bar's offerings slightly, adding a modest food menu that brought in additional revenue while still preserving the authentic character that made the Vulture's Roost feel like home rather than some sanitized corporate establishment. Doc's health had stabilized considerably, his doctors crediting the renewed sense of purpose and community engagement with improvements they hadn't expected to see at his age. He still insisted on manning the security monitors during quiet mornings, though these days it was mostly to watch for regular customers rather than dangerous threats, greeting familiar faces with the same warm enthusiasm that had made Emily feel welcome from her very first uncertain day. Tiny had appointed himself Emily's unofficial older brother, checking in on her, constantly teasing her relentlessly about her relationship with Jackson, and generally treating her with the boisterous, protective affection of someone who genuinely considered her family in every sense that mattered. And Jackson had moved into the small apartment above the bar alongside her, the space Emily had once occupied alone during those terrifying early weeks, now transformed into something that actually felt like a home rather than a temporary hiding place. He'd softened considerably over the months, the guarded, suspicious enforcer Emily had first met, slowly revealing more of the genuine, thoughtful man underneath that hardened exterior. Though he never lost the fierce protectiveness that had first drawn Emily's attention all those months ago. On a quiet evening in early autumn, Emily stood behind the bar, polishing glasses, watching the familiar rhythm of regulars filtering in for their evening drinks, listening to the comfortable murmur of conversation and laughter that filled the space, now instead of the tense, watchful silence that had characterized so many months of danger and uncertainty. Jackson approached from behind, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin against her shoulder. "You look happy," he observed quietly. "I am happy," Emily said, leaning back into his embrace. "I keep thinking about that first day, standing outside this door, terrified, with barely any money left, convinced I was making a mistake walking in here." "Best mistake you ever made?" Jackson asked, a teasing smile evident in his voice. "Best decision I ever made," Emily corrected, even though I didn't fully understand that at the time. Raymond, passing by with a tray of empty glasses, paused beside them, his weathered face creasing into the warm, genuine smile that had become so much more frequent over recent months. "Told you that first day," he said, "we protect our own. Guess we ended up protecting a lot more than just you in the process. You gave me a family," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion, despite months having passed since the danger finally ended. "Nobody's ever done that for me before. Not really." "You earned it," Raymond said simply, echoing words he'd told her once before, words that meant even more now, with everything they'd survived together. "Every single day since you walked through that door." As evening settled fully over the desert town, the Vulture's Roost glowed warm and inviting against the darkening sky, filled with laughter, familiar faces, and the unmistakable sense of belonging that Emily had spent so many desperate years searching for without ever quite finding it. The town outside still whispered stories about the Hells Angels bar on the edge of their community, still warned newcomers to stay away from the dangerous men who called it home. But Emily knew the truth now, a truth she'd discovered slowly, painfully, and ultimately beautifully over these past several months. The world saw criminals. Emily saw family. The world saw danger. Emily saw the people who had saved her life, not once, but again and again, without ever once asking for anything in return except her trust and her loyalty, both of which she'd given freely and completely. She thought about her mother's words all those months ago, the suggestion that she should have simply endured Daniel's cruelty because at least then she'd have somewhere to live. She thought about how wrong that advice had been, how staying would have meant slowly disappearing entirely, becoming smaller and smaller until nothing genuine remained. Instead, she had walked through the one door everyone told her to avoid, and on the other side she had found not danger but salvation. Not cruelty, but the fiercest, most unconditional loyalty she had ever experienced. Not an ending, but the beginning of the life she was always meant to live. The worst job nobody else wanted had become the greatest gift she had ever received. And as Jackson's arms tightened around her, as Raymond's laughter boomed across the room, as the entire found family that had rescued her from a life of fear and isolation continued their evening exactly as they had every evening for months now, Emily Carter finally completely understood. She was home. She was safe. She was loved. And nothing, not Daniel Cross, not Viktor Sokolov, not every warning the outside world had ever whispered about the dangerous men who wore leather vests and rode motorcycles through the desert night, nothing would ever take that away from her again.